A crimson wind howled across the wastelands of Korriban, not the kind that carried dust or sand, but the kind that carried memory, pain, power, and the voices of the dead. Before the Jedi knew fear, before the Sith became legend, there was only the Red World, barren, hostile, haunted. The Force moved differently here. It was not peace, it was hunger, and something ancient had learned how to feed. Long before Bane, before Revan, before the first lightsaber ignited in rage, there were rituals. Not performed, not invented, remembered. Because the Sith species were not like other beings, they did not tame the Force, they bled into it. Their priests did not pray. They carved wounds into reality and waited for it to scream back. And it always did. They believed pain had meaning, that death was not an end but a doorway if you knew how to open it. So they did what no Jedi would. They tried. In the shadow of obsidian cliffs, beneath the tombs not yet carved, the pure-blood Sith gathered. Eyes glowing gold long before corruption. Voices chanting in a tongue now forgotten. Their hands lifted toward the stars, not in hope but in defiance. The Force did not bless them. It punished them. And in that punishment, they found their gods. Something answered from below. No holocron recorded its name. No Jedi archive dares list it. But in the deepest caves of Korriban, something older than the Sith species had rooted itself into the stone. A presence, a hunger, a pattern of thought that was not thought-only will. It gave them their first right. To cut, to bind, to trap. Their victims were not enemies. They were sacrifices. And when their blood spilled into the dust, the wind carried it. And the Force shifted. Korriban was no longer just a world. It was a wound. And the Sith knew how to keep it open. Generations passed, names faded, but the rituals remained. The stars moved, the Jedi rose. But Korriban stayed the same. Beneath every dune, beneath every temple not yet built, something watched. It did not sleep. It remembered. These were not teachings, not lessons. They were instincts, inherited through blood, through dreams, through the Force itself. And every child born under the red sky felt it. The first priests did not fear death. They studied it. They called it by name. Some returned from it. Their flesh changed, their eyes wept black, their voices cracked like stone. But they returned, and that was enough. The Jedi would one day call it sorcery, alchemy, a perversion of the Force. But for the Sith it was a mirror, a way to see what they truly were, and what they could become. It wasn't darkness they served. It was freedom. Freedom from the Jedi's chains, from the rules of life and death, from the fear of becoming monsters. Because the truth was simple. They already were, and they had been, for a very, very long time. The first altar wasn't carved in stone, it was carved in flesh. Before temples rose and tombs were sealed with Force-wrought iron, there was only the blood of the living. The Sith did not need structures. Their altar was wherever agony was pure, wherever death was slow, wherever the Force trembled and could be shaped. It began with the high priests of the Kisai caste, the mystics of the Sith species. They were not warriors, they were keepers of memory, and in their memory lived chants that did not speak but command. Incantations laced with pain, obsession, and binding words the Force could not ignore. Each syllable cost a life. They learned how to twist the Force into form, not to heal, not to protect but to bind. They bound spirits to objects. They bound hate to weapons. They bound flesh to stone. And what they could not bind, they buried. The altar grew. It spread like a disease beneath the surface of Korriban. Not visible, not alive, but aware. Sith would walk into caves filled with dead silence, and walk out changed, not touched, claimed. Some spoke in foreign voices, some no longer felt pain. Some could kill with a gesture, and weep while doing it. But none could forget the altar, because it remembered them. The Kisai kept no records. Their knowledge was passed by ritual mind to mind, scream to scream. The greatest of their rites could not be taught. It could only be survived. Those who failed did not die. They became fuel, bones ground into ash, ash woven into charms, charms sealed into blades. And those blades never stopped whispering. Each weapon birthed in the altar's shadow carried a presence, a sickness. Some called it alchemy, others called it madness. The Jedi would one day call it a violation of nature. But to the Sith, nature was weak. Nature ended with death. Their power did not. One such weapon would live on for thousands of years. A sword curved and scorched black, pulsing faintly with a heartbeat not its own. When it was used, it didn't cut. It fed. Some said it belonged to Adars, the first Sith king. Others claimed it was older, made before language, before war, back when the altar still bled with each sunrise. But no matter its origin, the sword endured. And wherever it was taken, the altar followed. The first Jedi who encountered Sith sorcery did not understand what they saw. They believed the Force had been poisoned. But it had not. It had been taught to obey a different kind of will, not peace, not balance, but hunger. Because the Sith did not ask the Force for power. They took it, and the altar was proof it could be taken. Those who stood before it were stripped bare, their fears revealed, their pain amplified, their deepest regrets used as keys to unlock doors that should never open. And still, they walked forward, because on the other side of pain was power. Not everyone reached it. Some lost their minds, others lost their names. But the ones who returned never returned alone. They carried something with them, an echo, a scar, a hunger that would never leave. And when they spoke of it, they spoke with reverence, not to the gods, not to the Force, to the altar. It was never a place. It was a threshold, and every Sith who ever lived crossed it. The Jedi taught that the Force binds all living things, that it surrounds, penetrates, and connects. But the Sith knew something else, something older. They knew that blood could bind the Force itself. Not metaphor, not myth, literal, living blood spilt under the right conditions, in the right place, with the right intention could shape the will of the Force. And the Sith species were born with that knowledge. Their veins carried more than life. They carried memory, rage, power. Their rituals were not symbolic, they were biological. It was said that among the purebloods, some could feel the Force not with meditation, but with pain. A single cut across the palm could open visions. The deeper the wound, the louder the Force screamed back. Over time, this became doctrine. To reach the Force, one must be willing to bleed. Not once, not for show, but completely. To drain away the weakness of flesh until only will remained. The Kisai codified it first. They began mapping bloodlines not for nobility but for resonance, finding which families echoed deepest through the Force. Some were prized for anger, others for sorrow. The rarest were chosen for silence, a trait believed to bring balance to the rage. These bloodlines were not preserved. They were harvested. The strongest were brought to the altar. Their blood stored, studied, poured into the creation of new life or new death. What began as sorcery became science, and then it became prophecy. The Sith believed that one day, a being would be born whose blood did not merely respond to the Force, but command it. They began searching. Clones were made, hybrids bred. Entire cities hidden beneath Korriban's surface became labs of ritual suffering. Not all survived. That was the point. Because in death, truth revealed itself. Some blood evaporated under ritual heat, some darkened into tar, some very few shimmered when touched by Force lightning. Those were kept, sealed in black crystal phials, guarded by priest warriors who aged decades in days, drained by the burden of what they protected. It was not madness, it was belief. They believed the Force was not sacred, it was obedient, but only to blood that understood it. And so, the Force began to change. Waves of it moved differently on Korriban. Jedi who walked the planet felt sick, dizzy, disconnected, as if the Force itself was resisting them. It was. The planet had been bled too deeply. Its will no longer neutral. And when the exiled Jedi finally arrived centuries later, they didn't bring corruption. They found it waiting. Waiting in stone, waiting in memory, waiting in blood. One of them, a young, broken knight, stood before the altar and cut his own palm. The Force recoiled. Then it surged. It obeyed. He did not smile. He did not speak. He only bowed. The altar had chosen him, and when he left, he was no longer Jedi. He was Sith. This was how the Order was reborn. Not by words, not by war, but by blood. And it would always return to blood. Because every dark side ritual, every act of Sith alchemy, every whispered incantation traced back to one truth. The Force is power, but blood is the key. And the Sith would never stop turning it. They did not vanish when their bodies fell. On Korriban, nothing truly died. The red sand kept every scream, every whisper, every memory buried beneath its heat. Even before the tombs were carved, the Sith knew that death was never an ending. It was a door they learned how to reopen. The first priests discovered that the Force did not release the dead on this world. It held them, unwilling to forget the pain they carried. And the Sith reached for them, calling out across the veil. Some spirits whispered, some screamed, some obeyed. The Jedi would one day call it necromancy, a twisted break in the natural order. But for the Sith, it was communion. They were not summoning the dead. They were listening to what had never gone silent. The altar fed on this communion. Every emotion, fear, hatred, regret became a thread the Sith could pull. And when they pulled, the spirits moved. Some were trapped in stone statues, their eyes watching every intruder. Others were bound to blades and armor, lingering as echoes of hunger. A few, the most powerful, clung to the air itself, drifting like shadows seeking new hosts. The earliest Sith Lords learned how to anchor themselves beyond death, not fully, not cleanly, but enough to watch the living fall into the same darkness they once embraced. They did not call it immortality, they called it endurance, and endurance became law. When a Sith Lord died, their followers did not mourn. They built tombs not to honor but to contain. Tombs sealed with runes designed to trap the lingering rage within. Yet the rage always found a way to seep through the cracks. Travelers later reported hearing footsteps in empty halls. Others felt a cold hand brush their shoulder when no one stood behind them. Many fled, only a few stayed. Those who did were changed. The spirits did not choose at random. They reached for minds already cracked by loss or fury. These minds bent easily, reshaped by whispers promising power without end. And so the cycle continued. The living fed the dead guided the living, each generation darker than the last. What began as instinct became ritual. Ritual became doctrine. Doctrine became legacy. And on Korriban, legacy never sleeps. The first Sith learned one truth. Nothing was ever lost. Every scream, every cut, every betrayal remained woven into the planet's memory. They did not die. They waited, and the galaxy, though it did not yet know their names, would one day learn the cost of waking them. For the darkness beneath Korriban was not patient. It stirred each time a warrior fell, each time a priest cried out in triumph or despair. The planet drank all of it, and with every drop the spirits grew stronger. They gathered in silent covens, unseen by mortal eyes. Their presence thickened the air, bending the Force toward their will. When the exiled Jedi finally arrived, they felt it instantly, a weight pressing against their thoughts, testing their fears. Some mistook it for the planet's natural hostility. Others sensed the truth. They were being watched. The spirits did not lash out. They probed. They tasted the newcomers' anger, their guilt, their quiet hunger for more. And when they found one strong enough to break, they whispered. The Jedi listened. That was all it took. The first fall was not a choice. It was a response to voices older than the Order, older than any code or promise. The spirits wrapped around him like a cloak, feeding his doubts, sharpening his pain, forging his grief into purpose. And in that moment, he became the first of many. The dead had waited. Now, at last, they were answered. The sky over Korriban never changed. It bled red, even when the sun set. 1,000 years before the Great Hyperspace War, the clouds above the Valley of the Dark Lords churned without wind, thick, unmoving, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The Sith gathered, not as one order, but as rivals. Lords of ancient houses, alchemists of long-lost temples, prophets of death cults. They came draped in bone, in obsidian, in armor that still whispered with trapped voices. Each carried their own following. Each believed themselves stronger than the last. And yet they came together. Because the Dark Council had been summoned, 9 seats formed a half-circle atop the highest altar. The 10th, the seat of the reigning Sithari, remained empty. No one had claimed that title in generations. Not since the last one vanished into the shadows of Malachor, seeking a power the others feared to name. But something had changed. The rituals were no longer enough. The old ways, carving blood into stone, binding spirits to weapons, had begun to fade. Some claimed the Force itself was shifting, growing colder. Others whispered that a wound had opened elsewhere in the galaxy, a Jedi wound. And so the Sith returned to the beginning. They gathered under the crimson sky not for unity, but for survival. They had warred with one another for centuries, and now, even the Massassi, their warrior slaves, had begun to rebel in whispers. Something had to change. The first to speak was a woman known only as Vareen, tall, cloaked in shadows that moved on their own. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the wind like fire. "There is no peace," she said. "Not even here, not even among our own. But there is power still buried beneath us, and it will not give itself freely." The others listened, not because they respected her, but because they feared her. Vareen had survived the breaking of the Eshkar. She had returned from the spiral labyrinth of Dromund Kaz, with her eyes gone, burned away by a ritual she performed alone. She said she saw better now. The second to rise was Darth Maldrak, blood of Rel, sworn tyrant of the Outer Moons. His Massassi guards wore no armor, only blood paint. They stood silent behind him, weapons drawn but unmoving. "If we continue as we are," Maldrak said, We will fall to each other, or to the Jedi, I care not which. But if we bleed together, we may bleed longer. There was no applause, no consensus. The Dark Council never voted. They acted, and on that day, a new decree was spoken. The rite of endurance would be held again, a ritual not performed in 6 lifetimes, a test of spirit, of pain, and of loyalty. It would begin with the Massassi. The Council's decision was not law, it was challenge. Every lord had the right to refuse, but refusal meant weakness. Weakness meant death, and so none refused. As the suns fell behind Korriban's jagged horizon, the ground trembled, not from footsteps but from what stirred beneath. The old tombs, sealed for centuries, began to awaken. The sky deepened to black-red. Lightning flickered with no storm to call it. The force grew heavy, thick, and those who still breathed felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on them. Not memory, expectation, because Korriban had seen this before, and the planet remembered. The last time the Dark Council gathered like this, 1,000 slaves were burned alive to open a gate that should have stayed shut. The wind still carried their screams. Now it would carry more. The gathering had begun, and the red sky did not blink. They did not speak in turn. There were no rules, only presence. Each member of the Dark Council had killed to earn their seat. Not in open combat that was too simple. They killed with poison, betrayal, or rituals that erased bloodlines in silence. Their power was not measured in armies, but in the silence they commanded. When they gathered, it was not a meeting, it was a storm. Vareen stood first, again. Her voice, though low, moved through the others like smoke. "The rituals have failed us," she said. "The Force no longer screams, it only echoes." She turned to the Council's newest member, Darth Zoe. He was young by their standards, barely a century old. Yet he had mastered the rite of veins, binding his blood to a crystal that hovered above his shoulder at all times. It pulsed when he lied. Zoe stepped forward. He did not bow. "You speak of silence, Vareen. I hear nothing because you listen only to the dead." There was a murmur not from the Council, but from the Massassi lining the perimeter. Even they knew the weight of those words. But Vareen did not respond. She only smiled. Another voice cut in, one that did not belong to a person but a mask. Darth Ema wore the face of a fallen king, its eyes hollow and mouth sealed shut. He had not spoken in decades, not since sacrificing his voice to complete the binding of ashes. Instead, his thoughts moved through the Force, heard not in words but in feeling. Pain must be renewed. That was all. A simple statement, a verdict, and it was enough. Because every Sith present felt the truth in it. The Massassi had grown restless. The ancient rites once feared had become predictable. Even the sacrifices no longer screamed as long as they used to. Something had changed, and change meant fear. Darth Muldrak slammed his staff into the stone floor. His voice boomed without Force amplification. He had no need for tricks. "Then let us remind them," he said. "Not just the Massassi, the galaxy. Let them remember what power looks like when unshackled." He gestured toward the altar. It was older than any of them. Older than the Council itself, a slab of obsidian laced with crimson veins, pulsing faintly as if alive. "The rite begins at sundown," he said. "Each lord will offer one sacrifice, not a slave, not a traitor, one of your own." The silence that followed was different. This was not fear, this was calculation. To kill a rival's apprentice was common. To kill one's own was something else. It was not a gesture, it was a statement. Loyalty bled dry. Zhou did not blink. He nodded once. Vereen closed her blind eyes and turned away. Immer did not move. None refused. Far above, the red sky rippled. Not with clouds, with something else. As if the force itself was reacting. Or recoiling. This was what the council did best. They made pain sacred again. And soon, they would make it unforgettable. As the sun slid lower, long shadows stretched across the altar. The first chants began low, guttural tones from Massassi throats, joined by whispers from cloaked acolytes in the hills beyond. The voices of the Dark Council had spoken, and Korriban listened. Now, it was time for the galaxy to remember the price of power. The Massassi did not fear death. They feared being forgotten. Born from ancient Sith alchemy, shaped through war and ritual, they were creatures of muscle and obedience. Their skin bore the marks of countless rites, carved symbols, burned sigils, and scars that told their history better than any archive. To the Dark Council, they were soldiers. To the altar, they were fuel. As the suns fell behind the jagged cliffs, thousands of Massassi formed a circle around the obsidian platform. Their breath came out as hot mist in the cooling air. Their hearts beat in rhythm, felt through the ground like war drums. Tonight, they would not fight. Tonight, they would be offered. A single Massassi stepped forward first, a towering brute with crimson skin darkened by ritual ash. He carried no weapon. He did not need one. His name had been stripped away at birth. His purpose was clear. He knelt before Darth Muldrak, not in devotion, but in acceptance. Muldrak placed his hand on the warrior's forehead. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the force twisted a sharp pull, like the world inhaling. The Massassi's eyes widened, glowing brighter, as if something inside him was being pulled apart. And then he rose to his feet, silent, transformed. He was no longer a warrior. He was a vessel. The first chant began, a low rumble from the Massassi ranks, vibrating through the dust. Cloaked acolytes responded with higher tones, weaving sound into a rhythm as old as Korriban's mountains. The altar awakened. Crimson veins beneath its surface pulsed brighter, reacting to the presence of chosen blood. The ground hummed with a frequency the Jedi would have called unnatural. To the Sith, it was perfect. Darth Immer stepped forward next. His mask faced the vessel, empty and hollow, yet somehow staring. Immer raised his hands, and the air shuddered. The Massassi's body convulsed. His bones shifted, muscles tore and reformed. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened, then slowed again until it matched the altar's pulse. He did not scream. That was the point. Pain was not punishment. Pain was purification. The fire ignited. Blue flames burst from beneath the altar, not hot but cold, feeding on the vessel's life instead of heat. They climbed his body like living threads, wrapping around him in spirals of light. His eyes emptied of color. His veins glowed. The Massassi became something else. Something the Council had not seen in generations. A conduit. Through him, the force flowed like a river pulled from the deepest well of the dark side. His chest heaved with the pressure, every breath sending ripples of energy into the sky. This was the beginning of the rite, the renewal of power long dormant. Vereen approached him last. She placed her hand over his heart. The blue flames shifted to red. The vessel trembled. The force around them bent inward, tightening, condensing into the shape of her will. She whispered a final phrase, a word so old it no longer had meaning outside ritual. The Massassi collapsed, but he did not die. His body lay still, glowing faintly, his spirit bound between breath and oblivion, suspended, controlled, claimed. The flames withdrew, sinking back into the altar. And then the sky ruptured. A crack of red lightning tore across the clouds, silent but blinding. The air smelled of iron and smoke. The Massassi ranks fell to their knees, not in fear, but reverence. Immortal fire had returned to Korriban, and the Dark Council felt it. A surge of power sharp enough to cut, heavy enough to drown, ancient enough to remember their names. The ritual had only begun. The price was already paid. The Massassi vessel still breathed, but the breath was shallow, a quiet echo of the power burning through him. His body no longer belonged to itself. It belonged to the ritual, to the altar, to the Dark Council watching with cold interest. There was no applause, no triumph, only expectation, because one sacrifice was never enough. The second phase of the rite began as the sky deepened from red to near black. Torches ignited on their own, flaring with pale blue fire that cast long, trembling shadows across the valley. Those flames were not natural. They were memories, fragments of pain left behind from rituals performed centuries before. The air filled with whispers again, not the voices of the council, but the remnants of those who had died on this ground. Their presence pressed against the living, brushing their thoughts like cold fingers. Some Massassi bowed their heads. Others clenched their fists, steadying their minds against the weight of so many dead watching them. Darth Zhou stepped forward, his floating blood crystal dimmed, absorbing the tension in the air. He studied the vessel for several breaths, then turned toward one of his own acolytes, a young Sith whose eyes glowed with ambition. Zhou raised one hand. The acolyte froze. Not in hesitation, in obedience. He walked toward the altar and knelt beside the Massassi, lowering his head. His fear was clear, but his loyalty was stronger. He whispered the final words of his oath, knowing they were the last he would ever speak. Zhou placed his hand on his apprentice's back and gently pushed him forward. There was no cruelty in the gesture, only necessity. The apprentice lay flat on the stone. The altar responded. Crimson veins brightened. A pulse of energy rippled across the surface, cracking the stone beneath. The Massassi vessel shuddered, his eyes snapping open as the force surged between the two bodies linking them, fusing their pain, binding their life threads into one continuous scar. The ritual demanded balance. 2 lives, 1 outcome. Darth Ima raised both arms, and the silent presence of his mind washed over the altar like a tide. The air trembled. The acolyte cried out not in agony, but in shock as his consciousness brushed against something cold and ancient. The altar reached for him, and the force obeyed. His scream tore through the valley, a raw, desperate sound that echoed off the tombs. The Massassi vessel reacted immediately, convulsing as the apprentice's agony fed his transformation. The flames returned, rising in spirals, shifting from blue to red, then to a faint violet glow that no living Sith had seen in centuries. A forbidden color, a forbidden outcome. Vereen stepped closer, blind eyes turning toward the light. Her breath caught. She felt the shift, a deep, impossible pull beneath the force itself, as if the ritual had touched something beyond their control. Something that remembered the oldest rites, the first wars, the first king. The apprentice's scream faded. His body did not move again. The Massassi, however, rose, slowly, weakly, but alive. His eyes no longer burned red, they burned the same violet flame that danced over the altar's surface. A ripple of fear passed through the council. Power was expected. This was not. The force stilled, as if watching. Muldrak tightened his grip on his staff. Zhou stepped back, uncertain for the first time. Emma's masked gaze remained fixed on the vessel, and Varine, though blind, saw clearly what none of them wished to name. The ritual had changed. The altar had chosen. And when the Masasi opened his mouth and whispered a word in a voice that was not his own, every Sith present felt the truth sink into their bones. The price written in flesh was not theirs to decide. It never had been. She did not leave the Jedi Order. She was cast out. Sorcerer's Sin Jedi Knight, scientist, alchemist, became a traitor not for what she destroyed, but for what she wanted to understand. She believed the Force had no sides, that it was not light or dark, only raw, unfiltered, alive. The Council disagreed. They called her methods blasphemous, her questions dangerous, and so they exiled her. But exile did not break her. It freed her. She was among the first to walk away after the 100-year darkness. A war between Jedi who believed in the Force as harmony and those who saw it as fire. It ended with defeat. The victors sealed history behind closed doors. The defeated vanished into the stars. Sorcerers followed them, not for loyalty, not for revenge, but for knowledge. The journey led to a red world, a planet that hummed beneath her feet, that spoke in the language of pain and silence. Korriban, she did not fear it. When the exiled Jedi arrived, they expected ruin. Instead, they found civilization, the Sith species, strong in the Force, ruled by ancient kings and bound in blood. Sorcerers saw not a culture, but an opportunity. They worshipped the Force through rituals, through sacrifice, through alchemy. But their science was primal, untamed. She brought structure, precision, a mind trained by the Jedi, now unleashed. The Sith did not resist her. They called her off-worlder, but not with contempt. They feared her calm. They respected her control. And soon they followed her. What began as study became obsession. She watched Sith magicians twist flesh, pull spirits into stone, burn minds with words. It was crude, beautiful. She dissected their chants, broke them into equations, tested them in silence, measured their pain. Her first subject died after 3 hours. The second lived for 6. The third survived, but never spoke again. She wrote it all down. There was no cruelty in her work, only purpose. The Force, she believed, was not meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be rewritten. She called it transformation. And the Sith listened. They had known power through fear, through rage, through pain. But now, sorcerers showed them something else. A way to shape power without losing it. To bind life and death in formula. To create without limit. The Jedi had taught her restraint. The Sith showed her why they were wrong. She began to write. Not letters, not memoirs, instructions, glyphs etched with blood and sealed with memory. Her language was not spoken, it was activated. Her pages were not read, they were unleashed. The codex began as a tablet, then a scroll, then volumes, and finally, a holocron. Each entry was protected by pain, a wound in the Force only the worthy could open. In time, even the ancient Sith Lords began to copy her methods. Her alchemy spread like fire. She taught them how to merge beast and man, how to rip the Force from one and place it in another, how to live beyond the moment of death, in the flesh of something else. But she was not Sith. She never took their title, never bowed to their kings. She stood apart, a teacher, a godmaker, and they let her. Because they knew, without her, there would be no future, only ashes. And though she never claimed a crown or a tomb, her legacy would outlast them all. Because Sorcerer's Sin did not fall to the dark side, she became part of it. The Codex did not begin with knowledge. It began with pain. Sorcerer's Sin understood that truth early. That learning was not passive. It demanded something, a cost. And so every page she wrote was bought in suffering, hers or someone else's. The Sith called it power. She called it clarity. She did not write on parchment. Her first codices were engraved into obsidian, into temple walls, into bone. She carved her words with blades dipped in ichor. Each stroke was deliberate, measured, aligned with the breath of the Force. The act of writing itself became ritual. Every symbol had a sound, every sound a resonance in the Force. When chanted aloud, these lines did not instruct, they acted. The Codex was alive, a weapon disguised as scripture. But what made it dangerous was not its language. It was its memory. Each entry in the Codex recorded a transformation, an experiment, a failure, a death, and always what came after. The ritual of fire-blood fusion, the rite of cognitive dissection, the failed attempt to graft a Jedi's connection to a Sith-born vessel. These were not theoretical. They were experienced, witnessed, survived. One page recounted a test where a child was made to feel the death of every ancestor in his bloodline at once. He screamed until he forgot his name. She called that a partial success. Another described the separation of the soul from the body using harmonic dissonance, a pitch so precise it tore the subject's spirit loose, but failed to bind it. The room where it happened still whispered at night. No one entered it twice. Sorcerer's Sin did not flinch. She recorded everything. Not for glory, not for cruelty, for posterity. She knew she would not live forever, but her work would. The Sith Lords began to gather around her, hungry for the secrets she preserved. They came offering tribute, prisoners, artifacts, bloodlines, not out of faith, out of desperation. They wanted what she had. They wanted to create as she had. She let them watch, but never too closely. Because the Codex could not be given, it had to be earned, not through lineage, but through sacrifice. Those who tried to copy her work without permission went mad, not because of a curse, but because they lacked the context. Her symbols were not just instructions, they were doors, and without the proper key, they opened to nothing. Or worse, the Sith began to whisper that her writings were sentient, that the Codex could choose who understood it. Some said it spoke when read aloud. Others said it bled. None of them were entirely wrong. Over time, Sorceress began locking her chapters behind trials, not just physical, but spiritual. To access the pages on life extension, one had to first face the memory of their own death. To read the passage on dark matter transference, a user had to meditate inside a Force-nulled tomb for 9 days. The Jedi would later call these practices profane. But they never understood the price. Because to Sorcerer's Sin, knowledge without suffering was incomplete. The Force had to be touched with bloodied hands. And when she finally etched the final symbol of her 3rd volume, she did so using her own essence. The last drop of blood taken from her in a ritual that severed her connection to the Jedi forever. She felt nothing after. No sorrow, no doubt, only peace. Because the Codex no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the Sith, and it was still learning. Death was never a wall to Sorcerer's Sin. It was a veil, and veils could be parted. Where the Jedi saw finality, she saw invitation, a challenge issued by nature, one she was determined to answer. Sith alchemy had long explored the manipulation of flesh, binding muscles, mutating bones, fusing beasts. But Sorcerer's Sin pushed it further. She wasn't interested in creating soldiers. She wanted to create survivors, beings that refused to die, Her experiments began in silence. A single corpse, recently killed, untouched by ritual. She surrounded the body with obsidian shards engraved with her code. The air around it turned cold. The force recoiled. She spoke a phrase. The body twitched. Not reanimation, not yet, but reaction. A sign, a foothold. She refined the method, applied ichor mixtures, introduced sound resonance, and slowly, the corpse began to retain memory. It turned its head when spoken to. It wept, though it had no voice. Its skin did not rot. She called this process post-vital reinforcement, a state between life and death where the soul hovered but remained bound, trapped, preserved, responsive. The Sith Lords who witnessed it were silent. Then they began to offer her more subjects, not dead dying, criminals, traitors, failed apprentices, beings whose lives were measured in moments. They screamed through the ritual. Some begged for release. Others laughed as their minds broke. But a few, a precious few, returned. One of them was a Masasi, strong, loyal, scarred from war. He died with his eyes open. Sorzas placed her hand on his chest and uttered the words again, the same words from the Codex's seventh seal. He breathed, but his breath was wrong, cold, hollow. The Masasi stood, moved, responded, but he was not whole, not gone, either. He existed at the edge of the Force, tethered by alchemy. The Sith called him Kra than the bound flame. He became the first of many. Sorzas began refining the ritual, adding blood from Force sensitives, using Sith talismans as anchors, weaving identity into matter. Soon, her creations retained memory, personality, skill. They weren't undead, they were eternal. And yet, there was always a price. The bound suffered, their minds fractured slowly over time, their senses dulled. They became obsessive, drawn to whatever emotion had defined them in life: anger, loss, hunger. Left unchecked, they became feral. But Sorzas accepted that flaw. It was, to her, a reflection of truth. No one defied death without losing something. And if the cost was sanity, it was worth the knowledge gained. She recorded everything: failures, successes, modifications. She documented the soul's resistance, its resilience, how some spirits refused to return, while others clung to the flesh with terrifying strength. The Codex expanded. Entire sections now detailed the crafting of life, the merging of animal instinct with sentient will, creatures that could obey without thought, armor that bled when pierced, artifacts that whispered the names of their creators centuries after their deaths. Jedi historians would one day call these abominations. But they misunderstood her intent. She did not want to rule death. She wanted to understand why it ruled everything else. And in doing so, she reshaped Sith belief. No longer was power tied only to domination or war. Now, it could be preserved, stored, passed on. The Sith began to see legacy not as memory, but as matter, something physical, transferable. Sorzas' sin had not conquered death, but she had changed its shape. And when she closed her eyes at night, she knew if her body failed, her voice would remain, bound in symbols, breathing through her codex, waiting for the next hand to open the page. The codex of Sorzas' sin was never meant to survive. Not by Jedi hands, not by Sith. It was too complete, too precise, too dangerous. And yet, it endured. Long after the first lords of the Sith rose and fell, after the exile worlds were claimed and the dark temples were sealed, the codex remained hidden in pieces, scattered across tombs, buried inside holocrons, etched into walls where only blood could read the text. Because Sorzas knew what was coming, she had seen it in dreams. The fall of her students, the collapse of their empire, the Jedi, returning not as saviors, but as erasers wiping out knowledge, not evil. And so she broke the Codex apart. Each section was protected by layers of ritual encryption, spells that could not be spoken, only remembered. Some were sealed in force wounds, pockets of darkness where time moved wrong. Others were whispered into crystals that responded only to the pain of those who truly understood loss. She was not hiding the Codex from her enemies. She was hiding it from those who would misunderstand it. Because power without purpose was disaster, and knowledge without suffering was hollow. The Sith tried to replicate it. Many failed. Some tried to rewrite it in their own image. Others tried to erase her name from the record, calling her an outsider, a Jedi, a relic of weakness. But the Codex did not forget her. It bore her touch, a signature imprinted on every page, every glyph, every ritual. Her presence lived inside it, watching, waiting, judging. When Naga Sado rose to power, he carried fragments of her teachings. When Exar Kun burned the temples of Yavin, echoes of her alchemy bled through the stones. When Darth Bane uncovered the ancient texts that shaped the rule of two, he found whispers of her logic buried deep beneath layers of forgotten history. Even the Jedi, in secret, studied her. They found a copy during the cleansing of Rel, one that had been hidden in the bones of a dead starship, sealed inside a sarcophagus made of black glass. They opened it. 3 masters went mad. One never spoke again. The High Council ordered the Codex destroyed. But they failed. The symbols wouldn't burn. The text reformed when erased. Even in silence, it breathed. So they buried it. Deep beneath the Jedi archives, behind Force null barriers, in a vault with no name. And still, it whispered. Because Sorzas Sin had not written a book, she had created a mirror that reflected the cost of seeking the truth too far, too fast, without fear. And no one, not Sith, not Jedi, could stare into that reflection for long without breaking something inside themselves. The Codex became myth, a warning, a ghost story whispered by acolytes who weren't sure if it was ever real. But it was real, and it is still real. Every ritual that binds a spirit, every weapon that drinks life, every temple built on forgotten rules, they all begin with her. She did not claim a title, did not wear a crown, did not conquer planets, but she reshaped the very way Sith viewed the Force. Not as a storm, not as a blade, but as a system, a process, a series of symbols that could be written and rewritten. And so, even now, long after her body has turned to dust, Sorzas Sin speaks, through the Codex, through the scars it leaves, through the hands that tremble as they reach for its pages. Because the truth is simple. The Codex of Sorzas Sin was not lost. It was waiting. They were not welcomed when they returned. They were feared, because they had not come back as Jedi, and not entirely as Sith. They had become something else. 100 years of exile had carved the weakness from their bones. What remained were survivors shaped by war, broken by betrayal, hardened by the truth that the Jedi refused to face. The 100-year darkness had been more than conflict. It was an unraveling. The Jedi who had followed Sorzas Sin and her kin believed the Force should serve their will. That the light was not purity, only limitation. They experimented, combined life and death, forged weapons that remembered screams. They were cast out for it. But exile did not end them. it remade them. Some fled to Korriban. Others found places the Jedi would not follow, places where the dark side grew thick as ash, where old gods had long ago buried their names in the dirt. They studied, they endured, and in silence they changed. When they returned, their bodies were different, scarred, mutated, marked by rituals never seen before. Some had fused armor to their own flesh, their skin weeping black blood. Others whispered in tongues that cracked stone. But it was their presence that frightened the galaxy. They did not shine through the Force, they bled through it. Jedi Masters who faced them on the battlefield spoke of hallucinations, visions, voices calling to them from behind their own thoughts. Some reported time slowing. Others forgot who they were for moments at a time. The exiles called these effects shadows, echoes of the rituals they had buried deep inside themselves. They had learned to bind memories to the Force, to wear trauma as armor, to turn the moment of death into a weapon, and their enemies began to break before the fight even began. At the center of them were names that would be whispered for centuries: Karnas Muir, Sok-San, Remulus Draper. These were not lords, not yet. They were architects. Each carried scrolls etched in bone. Each guarded talismans that pulsed with the weight of captured souls. Each one had died once and returned different. The Jedi Order tried to understand what had happened to them, what had twisted their former brothers and sisters into these creatures of will and shadow. But there was no single answer. They had not turned to the dark side. They had dug into it. They had carved it open. And when it screamed, they listened. The first worlds they touched burned, not from fire, but from unraveling. Populations went mad. Whole cities fell silent, their people walking into the sea or vanishing into the forests. The Jedi blamed disease. But it was ritual. Rituals, powered by memory, by death, by lineage. The fallen Jedi had learned to thread the Force through bloodlines, not to preserve them, but to trap them. One family on Rel survived 14 generations under one curse, every child born with silver eyes, every child dreaming of the same battlefield they'd never seen. Muir had marked them, and he never took his mark away. This was the legacy of the 100-year darkness. Not just war, not just exile, but the creation of a new language, one written in suffering, in bone, in the silence between death and what waited beyond it. The Jedi could not follow. The Sith would not return the same. They weren't exiles anymore. They were a prophecy no one wanted to fulfill. He never spoke of the Jedi. Not once. Not even in anger. Because Karnas Muir had buried that identity long before his exile. The man who had once sworn to protect life had learned, through pain, that preservation was a lie. Life could not be protected. It could only be controlled. He found his truth not in books or meditation, but in failure, watching worlds burn because mercy had made him slow. Watching allies die because he had not acted with certainty. The Force, he realized, did not demand balance. It demanded control, and the body was the first battlefield. His earliest experiments were crude. In the caves beneath Korriban, Muir dissected creatures corrupted by the dark side. He found that fear left patterns behind visible changes in tissue, strange echoes in cellular decay. He began testing, not with weapons, with touch, with blood, with spoken words twisted into shapes the Force had never heard before. Subjects exposed to his voice began to mutate. Bones split, eyes melted, muscles tore themselves free from joints and reattached in new places. Some screamed, some laughed, some begged him to finish what he had started. He documented every reaction, every symptom, every failure, until he found a threshold, a point between suffering and surrender where the force itself seemed to twist, granting not death, but transformation. And so the Muir talisman was born, forged from dark alloy and bound with his own blood. It was not merely a tool, it was a gate, a bridge between will and flesh. Whoever wore it could spread the virus of Muir's, making a living contagion that reshaped sentient beings into something else. Rakhouls, creatures of hunger, rage, and silence, their minds wiped clean, replaced with an instinct to serve. Not themselves, not even the dark side. Muir, he controlled them with thought, not like puppets, like limbs. The Rakhouls became his army, but he did not use them to conquer. He used them to understand. He released them on test worlds, watched how populations resisted, studied how different species mutated in different ways, wrote his findings in journals sealed with bone clasps and blood wax. The Jedi, once they learned of it, were horrified. They called it blasphemy. But they misunderstood what he was doing. Muir wasn't trying to destroy life. He was trying to overwrite it, to create a form that could survive anything: war, time, extinction, a form that could serve one will forever. The talisman was indestructible. Jedi masters who tried to destroy it found their lightsabers flickering, their own minds invaded by visions they could not explain. Some saw themselves walking among the Rakhouls. Others heard Muir's voice whispering their name. The longer they held the talisman, the more they felt their own flesh begin to shift. And they always let go, but not soon enough. Even centuries later, the talisman would resurface, always with whispers, always with death. It left a trail of broken minds and altered DNA across forgotten tombs and derelict ships. Because Muir had succeeded, he had created something that lived beyond his own body. A ritual that wore skin, a virus that remembered. And through it, he never died. He became legend. Not as a warrior, not as a Sith, but as a thought, carved into the flesh of the galaxy. She spoke with a voice that didn't belong to her, and every time she did, something near her died. Zoshan was once a healer, a Jedi with quiet hands and careful words, but the 100-year darkness left no room for gentleness. When the Order turned against its own, she did not run. She walked into the storm, into exile, into Korriban. But unlike Muir, Xan did not seek to dominate the body. She sought to preserve the soul. Her belief was simple. Death should not erase consciousness. The Force should remember. The will of a being, their thoughts, fears, identity should survive the dying of flesh. And she set out to prove it. Zoshan's first experiments were failures. Rituals that pulled spirits from corpses, only for them to scream and vanish in seconds. She tried to contain them in crystals, in armor, in jars filled with liquid amber. None held. Some shattered. Some exploded. One opened a wound in the Force so deep that even she would not return to that chamber again. But she learned, slowly, and she listened. The Sith on Korriban called her mad, whispered that her presence cursed the ground, yet they came to her in secret, offering corpses, offering dying thoughts, offering their own lives if it meant their name would not be forgotten. She accepted all of it. Her breakthrough came when she realized the soul was not a flame. It was a thread, and threads could be woven. She created the first living talisman not forged of metal, but of flesh and bone, engraved with blood and sustained by breath. The talisman did not hold power. It channeled it. When worn, it allowed its bearer to absorb dying souls, not consume them, not enslave them, but store them in pieces. And it worked. She tested it on herself. Let a dying Sith Lord speak his final thoughts into her hand. She held it, carried it. Days passed, the voice stayed. She spoke his name, and he answered. Not fully, not clearly, but real. He remembered his last moment. He remembered her face. So San had done it. She had cheated oblivion. She refined the ritual into a rite called the binding breath. It could only be performed in moments of death timed with the final exhale. One word spoken, one gesture made, and the soul would split. Part would pass on. The rest would remain, bound. The talismans began to spread. Warriors wore them in battle, capturing the thoughts of fallen foes. Archivists wore them in tombs, gathering whispers from ancient bones. And Sith Lords wore them as crowns, their minds swelling with the counsel of the dead. But not all voices remained still. Some began to grow louder, began to speak when not spoken to. Some wearers reported memory loss, blackouts, moments where they acted without choice. Zog-San warned them. The soul, once split, does not rest. It shifts, waits, learns. She herself became a vessel for many. She no longer walked alone. Her own soul became a choir, a collection of voices that rose in moments of silence, guiding her hands, completing her thoughts. She was no longer just Zog-San. She was the ritual. One breath, one whisper, one thought passed from death into living memory. And long after her body crumbled, her talismans continued to speak. Some say they still do. That on quiet nights in the vaults of Korriban, a voice older than language can be heard repeating one phrase. I remember you. He died a legend, but it was a lie. Naga Sado did not perish in battle. He did not fall on the steps of a crumbling temple, or vanish in a blaze of force-born power. His death was planned not as an end, but as an illusion. A final deception, spoken not to the galaxy, but to time itself. After the Great Hyperspace War, Sado was hunted, not only by the Jedi but by his own. The Sith Empire had fractured beneath the weight of his ambition. Worlds lay in ruin, temples shattered, fleets turned to ash in the void. But Sado survived. He escaped to Yavin 4, a jungle moon forgotten by the stars, covered in mist, shrouded in silence. A world the Jedi ignored and the Sith no longer sought. A dead world, or so it seemed. There, hidden beneath tangled roots and obsidian stone, Sado built his last sanctuary. It was not a palace, it was not a throne, it was a tomb. But not for him. He called it the Temple of Final Knowledge. To outsiders, it looked like any other Massassi ruin, towering, ancient, decaying. But beneath it, carved into the rock with hands that bled starlight, Sado constructed something different. A ritual chamber, sealed from light, walled with iron runes, floors inlaid with kyber dust, and crystallized fear. It was not a place to rest. It was a place to wait. Because Sado had learned what others had only glimpsed, that the Force could remember, that it could be shaped, not just through will, but through time. He designed a ritual that would not finish, one that would remain incomplete, suspended between beginning and end. A ritual frozen in the moment of invocation, like breath held in lungs that never exhaled. Its purpose was unclear, even to those who later found pieces of it. The Jedi, who uncovered fragments of the glyphs, could not decipher the script. Sith scholars who traced the ritual back to Yavin called it a paradox. Because it was not made to act, it was made to listen, to wait for something, or someone. Sado placed himself at the center, not in spirit, not in memory, in flesh. A stasis pod buried beneath the temple. protected by wards that bent space, warped time, and sealed perception. No animal would approach it, no explorer would see it. He would sleep, and if the galaxy forgot him, the Force would not. That was his final deception. Not death, persistence. He left behind guardians, the Massassi, twisted by alchemy, bound to his legacy, kept alive by rituals they could no longer understand. They carved their stories in blood and silence. They forgot his voice, but remembered his name. And even as generations passed, they waited. The Sith believed he had fallen. The Jedi believed he was gone. But the Force remembered what he had placed there. A question, unanswered, and a hunger, unfed. The temple of the dead world did not crumble. It grew, not upward, inward. The walls pulsed. The stone breathed. The ritual remained unfinished, waiting for the right voice, the right presence, the one who could finish what Sado never intended to end. And when that day came, Yavin 4 would no longer be silent. Most Sith rituals begin with a sacrifice. This one began with silence. Deep beneath the Temple of Final Knowledge, the ritual chamber was built without windows. Light had no place here. Neither did time. The moment one crossed the threshold, the Force shifted not into darkness but into stillness. It was like walking into a thought that hadn't been spoken. Naga Sado had crafted the chamber as a paradox. The ritual he began was designed not to complete itself, but to remain active indefinitely, a fracture in the Force that would pulse through the centuries like a buried wound. He called it the suspension of becoming. To the Sith, it was his masterwork. To the Jedi, it would have been incomprehensible. But to the Force itself, it was a test. The ritual required no blood at first. No chanting, no sacrifice, only presence. A living mind, shaped by will and focused on the convergence point, the altar that floated inches above the floor. Anchored by nothing, Sado poured his knowledge into it, his fears, his visions. He encoded them not as text, but as emotions sealed inside a lattice of crystallized memory. He intended the ritual to do one thing. Wait for another Sith to find it, not to awaken him, to finish it. But finishing the ritual meant more than continuing a chant or activating a device. It required the one who found it to pour themselves into the pattern, not just their strength, but their story, their failures, their death. That was the secret. The ritual was not a spell. It was a mirror. It could only be completed by one who shared Sado's fear, the fear of becoming nothing. As centuries passed, the temple endured. Storms ravaged the moon. The Massassi devolved. Civilizations rose and fell. And still, the ritual hummed beneath it all. Every few decades, explorers stumbled upon it. Mercenaries, tomb raiders, cultists, even fallen Jedi. Some got close. One even managed to speak part of the invocation. He died instantly, his body twisted, not from violence, but from dissonance. His mind had not been ready. His will had not aligned. The ritual rejected him. It always did. Until one day, it didn't. The Force shifted when the right soul approached. Not strong, not wise, but fractured. Someone carrying guilt like armor, rage like breath. Someone who had touched the edge of the void and wanted more. The ritual felt it, and the altar began to glow. But the ritual did not consume. It welcomed. A vision unfolded, not of power, but of memory. Of Sado himself, standing alone in the chamber, speaking a phrase he never finished, reaching forward, his hand trembling. Not in anger, in fear. Fear of being forgotten. fear of sleeping forever in a world that no longer needed him. That was what the ritual preserved. Not dominance, not revenge, a final, unfinished cry for meaning. And now, the one who stood in the chamber had a choice, not to destroy, not to awaken, but to answer. Few ever did. Most turned away, because what waited at the center of that ritual was not a voice. It was a reflection, and reflections don't lie. The ritual could not end, not because it was broken, but because it was waiting for someone who understood why it had been created in the first place. The Massassi did not know what the ritual meant. They only knew they were bound to it. Generations passed on Yavin 4, long after Naga Sado entered his stasis chamber. His warriors, once proud and disciplined, became something else. Time reshaped them. Silence hollowed them. The jungle reclaimed their cities, wrapping vines around their towers and dragging entire halls into the soil. But the Massassi survived, changed, twisted, enduring. They lived in the shadow of a master who no longer breathed, guarding a ritual they could not finish and could not abandon. Some forgot their names, others forgot language, but none forgot the temple. It called to them in dreams. They would wake in the night, palms bleeding, having carved symbols into the earth they did not remember learning. The marks glowed faintly, matching the pulse of the buried chamber. These were echoes of the ritual, instinctive gestures passed down through blood, through fear, through ancient memory. To live near the chamber was to feel it. A constant hum beneath the skin, a vibration that crawled up the spine and settled behind the eyes. Some Massassi went mad from it. They wandered into the jungle and vanished. Others became violent, lashing out at shadows only they could see. A few were drawn downward, deeper into the temple's stone throat, compelled by a pull they could not resist. No one stopped them, because the Massassi believed those chosen were not being taken. They were being called, and so they watched as their brothers disappeared into the dark, never to return. They built shrines for them, lit fires in the rain, whispered prayers to gods older than the Sith. But the truth was darker. Those who entered the chamber were not consumed by the ritual. They became part of it. Their minds dissolved into the force-saturated air. Their bodies crumbled into ash that settled in the cracks of the floor, feeding the lattice of memory Sado had created. Their essence was absorbed, recorded, preserved. The chamber was not waiting for one soul. It was gathering many. Time moved differently beneath the temple. Days stretched, years twisted. Some Massassi lived entire lifetimes without noticing their own aging. Others grew old in a handful of seasons. The ritual warped everything around it, not with malice, but with hunger. It was never meant to be stable. It was meant to grow, and it grew best in silence. The Massassi became shadows of themselves. Their once bright eyes dimmed. Their bodies hardened into something closer to stone than flesh. They painted their skin with blood to remind themselves they were still alive. Some worshipped the ritual. Some feared it. All obeyed it. When travelers came, explorers, cultists, lost Jedi, the Massassi watched from the treetops. They tested them with silence, measured their fear. Those who walked confidently were allowed to pass. Those who trembled were driven away. Because the ritual did not want weakness, it wanted will. The deeper one walked into the temple, the more the walls seemed to breathe. Symbols shifted when unobserved. Torches lit themselves. Footsteps echoed as though someone followed just out of sight. And in the heart of the chamber, beneath a barrier of half-light and pulsing crimson, lay Sado's stasis pod untouched by time. He did not age. He did not dream. He did not die. He hovered on the edge of awareness, kept alive by a ritual designed to wait forever. And the Masasi waited with him, century after century, their minds fraying, their bodies warping, their souls bending around the unfinished shape of his last design. They waited because the ritual needed them. They waited because they had no choice. And they waited because something beneath the temple was beginning to wake. Time should have ended the ritual, but on Yavin 4, time was only another prisoner. Centuries passed above the temple. Civilizations rose, burned, and were forgotten. The Jedi rebuilt themselves. The Sith tore themselves apart over and over again. Stars were born and died in the night sky. But beneath the soil, nothing changed. Not truly. The ritual kept breathing. Slow, steady, endless. It did not grow weaker as the years marched on. It grew patient, like a wound that refused to close, like a whisper that became clearer each time it was ignored. The force around the temple trembled, waiting for a moment that had not yet come. When the Masasi finally died out, the ritual did not mourn them. It had already taken what it needed. Their essence lived inside the chamber. Their memories, their fear, their loyalty, all woven into the unfinished pattern Sado left behind. The world around the temple changed. Strangers arrived, some seeking knowledge, some seeking power, some simply lost. The jungle tried to swallow them whole, but the ritual learned to call softly just enough to draw the curious closer. Vines shifted, stones reformed, passages reopened that should have collapsed thousands of years before. It wanted to be found, but not by anyone, by the right one. The curse did not spread like a plague. It moved like a thought, subtle, patient, searching. It drifted through the Force like a cold breath, brushing against the minds of Force sensitives across the galaxy. Most ignored it. Some shivered without knowing why. A few dreamed of red temples and empty halls. Those dreams grew clearer with time. When Exar Khan arrived on Yavin 4, centuries after Sado's era had faded into myth, the ritual stirred. It recognized something familiar, not his strength, not his knowledge, his fear. The same fear Sado had carried, the fear of becoming nothing, of being forgotten, of watching greatness rot into dust. The unfinished ritual reached for him, the way a drowning hand reaches for another drowning hand. Khan felt the pull. He walked into the temple, unaware he was stepping into a question left unanswered across a millennium. The chamber welcomed him. The walls brightened, the altar lifted, the air thinned. The past opened like a mouth. Sado's stasis pod pulsed. Not awake, not alive, near. But the ritual did not want Sado anymore. It wanted continuation. Kun touched the altar. The ritual changed. What had been waiting became active. It showed him visions, Sado's triumphs, his failures, his fear. It revealed the cost of becoming eternal. It whispered that he could be greater, stronger, remembered longer. All he had to do was finish the sentence. Sado never finished. Khan did, without knowing what it meant, without understanding what he had given. The ritual surged, completing a shape that had taken 1,000 years to form. The chamber screamed. The Force twisted. The Masasi awoke in blind devotion. Sado remained in stasis, forgotten in the chaos he himself had prepared. The curse moved forward, alive again, growing again. It burned through Khan, binding itself to him, turning him into a vessel of ideas older than his lineage, the same hunger, the same ambition, the same refusal to die. Sado's curse had crossed time. Kun was only the next host, and long after Kun fell, long after Yavin burned under imperial bombardment, Long after the temple cracked and the jungle swallowed it once more, the ritual survived. Waiting, always waiting, because time cannot kill a question. And the one shadow left behind still echoes in the Force, unanswered, somewhere beneath Yavin's soil, in a chamber that breathes without air. A presence still lingers, patient, silent, aware. The ritual is not finished, and until someone ends it, the dead world will never sleep. There are places in the galaxy where the Force does not flow, it recoils. Malachor was one of them. It had not always been that way. Before the wars, before the betrayal, before the silence, Malachor was a living world, wild, ancient, the kind of place Jedi rarely visited and Sith never forgot. But Revan saw something else. He saw potential, a wound waiting to be opened. The war against the Mandalorians had pushed the Republic to its breaking point. Worlds fell faster than fleets could defend them. Entire systems vanished from the maps. The Jedi hesitated. Revan did not. He broke away from the Council, gathered allies, created an army that answered to him alone. And for a time, they won. He turned the tide of the war through brilliance, charisma, and force of will. But Malachor was different. Revan did not just want to win. He wanted to send a message. He chose Malachor not for its location but for its nature. Beneath the surface, buried beneath layers of stone and silence, lay something forgotten. A presence older than the Jedi. A fracture in the Force where dark rituals had once bled into the soil. Revan felt it, and he listened. He ordered the planet fortified. His engineers arrived first, followed by his mystics, former Jedi, who had walked too far down his path to return. They studied the stone, deciphered ancient Sith carvings, and reported that Malachor's core hummed with dormant energy. It was not a nexus. It was a scar, and Revan would make it bleed. The mass shadow generator was conceived in that silence. Publicly, it was a superweapon, a tool designed to manipulate gravity on a planetary scale. But Revan knew it was more than that. The device required calibration, not just engineering, but alignment with the Force. Ritual guidance. He recruited technicians who whispered to crystals, attuned circuits to emotion, and read magnetic fields like prophecies. No one questioned him. Not yet. Revan spent days alone on the surface, meditating, not in peace, in calculation. He knelt among bones left by the Sith who had once ruled here, felt the hatred still clinging to the stones. He did not resist it. He spoke to it. He asked it to remember, to rise again when the time came. Some of his closest allies began to worry. His presence darkened. His voice grew distant. He spoke less of freedom and more of purpose. The war was no longer just about saving the Republic. It was about reshaping it. And Malachor was the crucible. When the Mandalorian armada approached, he smiled. The trap was set. His own forces would serve as bait. And when the enemy fleet gathered above the planet, Revan gave the order. The device was activated. The Force shattered, and Malachor became a grave. But before the explosion, before the screams, before the echo that would never fade, something else happened, something no record captured. In the final second before the generator's pulse, Revan knelt once more in the heart of the temple. He closed his eyes, and he offered something, not a plea, not a prayer, a piece of himself. He did not detonate a weapon. He completed a ritual. And when the planet tore itself apart, Revan did not die. He split. It was never just a machine. Not to Revan. Not to the Force. The mass shadow generator began as a theoretical weapon, a device capable of folding gravity in on itself, crushing fleets, shattering planets, ending wars in a single breath. But for Revan, it became something else long before it activated. A ritual of intention, a sacrifice waiting to happen. Its architect, Mitra Surik, believed she was building a tool, a last resort, something to stop the Mandalorians when all else failed. But she did not know what Revan knew. She did not feel what he felt on Malakor's surface. The ancient Sith wounds were still alive, still hungry, still listening. Every piece of the generator was assembled in a chamber carved from the ruins of an older temple, a place where death had been stored for centuries. Its circuits hummed with force saturation, absorbing whispers from the stone. Even the kyber used to stabilize its core pulsed like a heartbeat, as if reacting to the ritual beneath it. Revan oversaw every stage. He corrected the engineers. He rewrote the formulas. He altered the harmonic frequencies, not to make the device stronger, to make it aligned. He needed it to resonate with the same fear, the same hunger, the same darkness that once consumed Malakor. He needed the machine to answer the planet's wound. And it did. The technicians noticed strange anomalies, gravitational spikes that appeared without cause. Lights dimming when Revan entered the chamber, echoes in the air that didn't match any natural vibration. One technician claimed she heard voices inside the metal whispers rising and falling in a pattern she could not understand. She asked to leave. Revan reassigned her. She was never seen again. Surik sensed something wrong as well. The closer the device came to completion, the more the force around it thinned like breath being held by something immense and invisible. She confronted Revan once, only once. "Is this still a weapon?" she asked. Revan answered, "It's a lesson." She didn't understand. Not yet. The generator was installed at the heart of the battlefield, buried deep underground, surrounded by layers of shielding and ritual wards disguised as structural supports. The Mandalorians never knew. The Republic never suspected. Only Revan understood the truth. This weapon did not just destroy matter. It destroyed will, connection, the invisible threads that tied living beings to the Force. A fitting offering for a world already carved open by ancient pain. The day of activation was quiet. No speeches, no celebration. Only tension, a feeling that something irreversible was about to happen. Surik stood at the control console, her hand trembling. She felt everything. The Mandalorians above, ready for war. The Republic soldiers below, trusting her. And beneath it all, Malakor's voice, growing louder with every passing second. Revan placed his hands on her shoulders. "Do it." When she hesitated, he whispered, "This is the only way." The console lit, the machine awakened. Gravity twisted. First, the Force screamed, a sound no ears could hear, but every soul felt. Then the battlefield convulsed, as if the planet itself were trying to flee from what was coming. And then silence. A pulse erupted outward, not light, not sound. A collapse, a tearing. Reality folded in on itself. Ships shattered, bodies were crushed into nothing. Millions died before they even understood they were dying. The Force recoiled. And then, it broke. Surik felt herself cut off. Not pushed away, severed. A wound carved into her soul, deep enough that it would echo across the rest of her life. She collapsed, gasping, as the machine shut down on its own. Revan did not fall. He remained standing in the dark, watching, listening. The mass shadow generator had done more than win a war. It had finished what Malakor began. And Revan was no longer whole. He didn't scream. He didn't kneel. He didn't even blink. When the generator activated and the force screamed back, Revan simply watched. His eyes reflected the annihilation above Malachor, but they did not flinch, because something inside him had already broken. The moment was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was cold, quiet, inevitable. A silence that crept in like a tide and never left. Revan stood in the ruins of his own victory. Around him, the echoes of death hung in the air like fog. The force should have surged, should have roared. Instead, it felt like breathing inside a coffin, too still, too shallow, too late. He had killed millions, and he had done it with purpose. But that wasn't what shattered him. What broke Revan was what didn't happen. He expected clarity, release, a sense of finality that never came. He had believed that the mass shadow generator was the answer, a punishment for the Mandalorians, a warning to the galaxy, a sacrifice that would redeem the sins no one else would commit. Instead, he felt nothing. No light, no triumph, just a shadow deeper than he'd ever known. Because Malachor hadn't just taken lives, it had taken connection. Revan reached for the Force, and it pulled away, not completely, but enough to feel the distance. The trust was gone. That's when he understood. He hadn't just scarred the planet. He'd scarred himself. The ritual wasn't complete because it was powerful. It was complete because it was irreversible. And in that silence, Revan began to split. Not in body, not even in thought, but in belief. Part of him still clung to the idea that he was right, that the Jedi had been weak, that the Republic had been crumbling, that someone had to take control. But the other part, the part that stared into the void, Malachor had realized something else. He had become what he hated. Not a tyrant, not a hero, an echo, a hollow. From that day forward, Revan stopped being one person. He became two voices sharing one breath, the strategist and the seeker, the warlord and the penitent, the Sith who knew what must be done, and the Jedi who still wished it had been different. He left Malachor in silence. Mitra Surik, the Jedi who had activated the device, would never truly understand what she'd helped create. She had followed orders, trusted her general, believed in the cause. But when the Force severed her in that moment, she too became a wound. Revan saw her pain and said nothing, because he recognized it. They were both broken now. Not by the war, not by the machine, by the choice. Revan returned to his fleet changed. Those closest to him noticed the shift. His voice grew colder, his presence darker. He spoke less often. His eyes lingered longer on the stars, as if searching for something that wouldn't reveal itself. He began speaking to the holocrons more than his allies, studying Sith teachings not out of curiosity but out of need. He wasn't looking for power anymore. He was looking for meaning. The Jedi had turned their backs on him. The Republic no longer deserved saving, and the Mandalorians had been annihilated. So what was left? Malachor had answered that question. Nothing, only the silence. And it was in that silence that Revan heard the next voice. Some wounds bleed once, others bleed forever. Malachor was the second kind. Long after the mass shadow generator fell silent, after the screaming stopped, after the ships were gone and the bodies forgotten, the wound remained. It was not visible, not measurable, but it existed. A fracture in the Force, and Revan carried it with him. He returned to the galaxy not as a savior, not even as a conqueror, but as something harder to define. His words were colder, his cause more absolute. He called himself Sith, but not like the others, not with hunger, with certainty. Revan had seen what it meant to win a war and lose the soul of a galaxy. He had sacrificed connection, innocence, and memory. Now he walked forward as a shadow of what he once believed. The Jedi called him lost. The Sith called him powerful. Neither was right. He was a wound, still open, still bleeding. The mass shadow generator had done more than destroy fleets. It had carved a scar into the Force itself, one that no ritual, no temple, no master could ever cleanse. Mitra Surik would later return to Malachor and find only silence. Even the Force was hesitant there, like a breath held too long, like a scream never released. She would kneel on the shattered stone and feel nothing. Not peace, not rage, just absence. It broke her again, because that place remembered her. And it remembered Revan. The ritual that began in Revan's mind, powered by a superweapon and sanctified by genocide, had reshaped more than a battlefield. It had reshaped fate. Revan's enemies became shadows in history. But the effects of that day rippled forward through the Republic, through the Jedi, through the Sith. The galaxy would never be the same, because the Force had been wounded, and like any wound, it grew infected. That infection took many forms: civil war, betrayal, darkness growing in corners no one watched, Jedi turning away from their teachings, Sith rising with memories that were not theirs. And always, the echo of Malachor beneath it all. Revan would vanish eventually. He would fall to darkness, rise again, be captured, fragmented, erased, remembered, lost. But he never healed. Not truly. The ritual remained unfinished. Not in practice, in meaning. Because Revan never found what he hoped for at the end of it. No clarity, no absolution, just distance. The Jedi tried to forget him. The Sith tried to claim him, but neither understood the truth. Revan did not fall. He was broken open, and through that break the Force changed. His legacy was not a crown or an empire. It was a question. What do you become when you burn everything and survive? Some called him a savior, others a monster, but the Force called him something else. It called him a memory that refused to fade, a ritual carved into the fabric of time, a presence that lingered long after death. And deep beneath the surface of Malachor, in the forgotten temple where he once offered himself to the dark, the echoes remain, not loud, not angry, just quiet, waiting, because wounds do not scream. They whisper, and Revan's whisper has never truly stopped. He had once been a man, but even that truth faded. No one remembered his name, not his homeworld, not his face, not his history, because Nihilus had devoured all of it, not just from the galaxy, but from himself. The wound began at Malachor, not the place, the moment. He had stood among the ashes of the mass shadow generator's destruction, a Jedi Knight, still breathing, still sane, but only barely. The Force had screamed when the weapon detonated, and some part of him had tried to scream with it and failed. Something inside him collapsed, not his body, his presence. He reached for the Force, but it didn't return, not as it had before. It came to him distorted, amplified, starving, and when he touched it, it consumed him. It did not feel like power. It felt like emptiness with a voice. He survived, but not whole, not even broken. He became absence. At first, others tried to speak to him, to help, to name him. But when they stood too close, they collapsed. Their life drained, their minds hollowed. They died with eyes wide open and silence on their lips. He did not mean to kill. But hunger does not ask permission. He wore a mask, not to hide his face. He no longer had one. The mask preserved the illusion of identity, a shape to speak through, a face for the galaxy to fear. It was a relic, Sith-made, bound to his withered will. He became a whisper, a shape, a sound without breath, and in time, a name. Darth Nihilus, but he never spoke it. He had no language, no voice, no thoughts that echoed in words, only need. His presence in the Force became a black hole. It pulled endlessly. Not only life but memory, identity, light. He didn't seek conquest. He didn't desire control. He hungered. Entire planets trembled when he approached. Not from orbit, from within. Worlds sensitive to the Force felt his arrival hours in advance. Oceans turned still. Animals fled in silence. Jedi meditated and found only static. He did not speak. He did not threaten. He simply arrived. And then, the planet screamed. The first time was accidental. A small world weak in the Force, barely known, barely mapped. He set foot on its surface. A village collapsed. Birds fell from the sky. The air itself grew thin. He breathed in, and the world emptied. From that moment forward, he learned not how to stop it, how to aim it. The Sith of his era feared him, revered him. They called him the Lord of Hunger, not as flattery, but as prophecy, because Nihilus was not just a Sith Lord. He was what came after a Sith Lord was broken. He did not raise armies. He attracted them. Those drawn to his power became warped. Their thoughts dulled. Their loyalty sharpened. They followed him without question, as if his hunger called to theirs. He did not lead. He fed, and they followed the scent of death. What remained of his thoughts was preserved in holocrons too dangerous to open. Sith Lords who attempted to interpret them either vanished or went mad. Some claimed they heard their own voices speaking back to them, whispering secrets they had never known. No one knew what he wanted. Because want implies a mind. Nihilus was not alive. He was survival, wrapped in ritual. And he was still starving. The Force sustains all life. But for Nihilus, it was life. Not in balance, not in harmony, not as a path. As a necessity, something he had to consume simply to remain tethered to existence. His condition was no longer a state of being. It was a hunger ritual that never ended. He had not created it. He had become it. Every moment of his life was a rite of starvation. The Force bled away from him, even when he was still. And when he moved, it screamed. There was no ceremony, no incantation. His ritual did not require words or tools. It was his presence, raw and devouring, like a tear in reality that couldn't close. But Nihilus was not ignorant. He understood what he had become, and he studied it. Somewhere, in the dark corners of deep space, he constructed a throne not of stone, but of silence. His ship, the Ravager, was a shattered war vessel held together by the Force alone. Its systems were dead, its crew half-living. But it moved when he willed it, guided by echoes of pain that only he could hear. He gathered artifacts, old Sith texts, fragments of holocrons, remnants of rituals from the time before the Republic. He did not read them. He absorbed them, fed off the memory of the knowledge, stripping meaning away until only raw Force energy remained. He studied not the how of rituals, but the why. Because somewhere beneath the hunger was a question. Was he the ritual's master, or its prisoner? The Jedi who studied him would later call it a wound in the Force, a place where life could not grow, where presence faded, where vision faltered. But that was only the effect, not the purpose. Nihilus learned how to focus the ritual. He could project it outward across cities, across continents. He once stood at the edge of a temple and reduced an entire moon's surface to dust, its inhabitants crumbling without a sound. Their deaths did not feed him with power or emotion. They filled the silence, temporarily, and the silence always returned. He began to sense force sensitives before they knew themselves. Children born with connection cried out in pain before ever seeing his face. He followed their echoes like a predator stalking breath. World after world. Jedi sanctuaries, Sith tombs, remote enclaves. Each fell the same way, their presence absorbed, their memories unwritten. Not by armies, by absence. He did not feast to grow stronger. He fed to not collapse. The ritual had evolved beyond his control. It was his breath, his pulse, his thoughts. Every step he took was another movement in the ancient dance of void and consumption. But it had a flaw. The more he fed, the faster he faded. Every act of consumption tore a piece of him away, not physically, spiritually. What was left of his identity grew thinner. His thoughts became scattered. His purpose, if it had ever existed, dissolved into instinct. Eventually, he stopped hearing voices, even his own. And yet, he kept feeding, because the alternative was worse. To starve would be to vanish, to disappear completely, to finally collapse into the nothing he had feared since Malachor. So he moved, he hunted, he devoured, not out of cruelty, not for power, but to delay the inevitable. Nihilus did not hate life. He simply could no longer be part of it. And in his hunger, he performed the most terrifying ritual the galaxy had ever known. One that never stopped. One that had no altar, no audience, only victims and silence. Worlds learned to fear him long before they knew his name. Because Nihilus never arrived quietly. The first sign was the wind. It stopped. Then the ocean stilled. Animals froze where they stood, sensing something that did not belong to life or death or anything in between. The force itself recoiled. When the Ravager entered orbit, no alarms sounded, no fleets intercepted. The ship was little more than a corpse drifting through space, held together by will alone. But beneath its broken hull, Nihilus waited. His presence fell like night. Whole continents felt it at once, whispering through the force, thin as breath and sharp as a blade. Jedi, stationed on distant posts, staggered, clutching their chests. Younglings cried without knowing why. Masters meditating in silence suddenly found their thoughts drowning in static. Then came the hunger. Nihilus did not walk onto planets. He consumed them from afar. He would stand at the bow of the Ravager, motionless, faceless, a black silhouette against dying starlight. The air around him trembled. His robes billowed in a wind no one else could feel. And then, with no gesture, no chant, no blade, he opened himself. The force collapsed inward. It was not a pull, not a drain, not a scream. It was a vacuum absolute and merciless. Life energy tore free from bodies before they had time to fall. Forests withered in seconds, rivers dried and cracked. Cities turned silent as every heartbeat froze at once. Children died in their mothers' arms. Warriors died with their weapons still raised. Jedi died mid-meditation, their souls ripped out before they sensed danger. And through it all, Nihilus stood still. If he felt anything, no one knew. His hunger had no emotion, no satisfaction, no cruelty. It was instinct, ritual, survival. And when the last breath of the last living thing faded, he inhaled the echo, a long, slow intake that reverberated through the Ravager like thunder. Then he moved on. Jedi historians struggled to understand him. They tried to call him a Sith Lord, but the title didn't fit. Sith had goals. Sith had ambition. Sith wanted to rule. Nihilus wanted nothing. He was nothing. A shadow that fed not for domination, but because the void within him demanded it. A creature whose survival came at the cost of existence itself. There were some planets strong enough to resist for moments. Worlds rich in the force verdant, ancient, alive. Nihilus devoured those first. Because they were louder. Because they filled the silence for longer. The most tragic were the Jedi worlds. Enclaves built for learning, for healing, for meditation. He devoured them like dying embers, leaving only ashes and crumbled temples behind. Some Jedi tried to fight him. None succeeded. One master reached him through the Force only for her connection to shatter like glass. She fell, sobbing, unable to sense even her own breath. She survived, but empty, her voice trembling as she whispered. There was nothing in him, no thought, no self. Only hunger wearing a mask. Republic trackers tried to predict his path, but Nihilus did not follow strategy. He followed the scent of life. The stronger the presence, the sooner he arrived. Entire hyperspace routes went silent in his wake. Planets that once shone bright in the Force became voids, black smudges on the senses, like scars that would never heal. Some believed he could consume the galaxy. Others believed he already had piece by piece, silence by silence. Because after he left a world, it never recovered. Not in spirit, not in memory, not in the Force. His shadow did not simply fall on planets. It erased them. There are beings the Force creates, and there are beings the Force endures. Nihilus was neither. He was a breach, something that slipped through the cracks of a dying moment and kept falling long after it should have ended. Even the Sith could not accept him. They called him Lord, but only because they had no other word. The title meant nothing. Nihilus did not rule. He did not teach. He did not build legacies. He did not seek a throne. He drifted through existence like a storm that did not know it was a storm. Atris once wrote that he was the Sith who should not exist. Not a prophecy, a warning. Because Nihilus broke the rules that shaped both Jedi and Sith. All Force users understood connection, the invisible thread tying every living thing to the next. Nihilus was the severed thread. A life whose connection had inverted, becoming a hole instead of a line. He moved through the galaxy like a wound that refused to close. On worlds where he fed, the Force became thin, stretched to breaking. Jedi meditating there would feel only nausea, confusion, a hollow ache behind the ribs. It was not darkness. Darkness is presence. This was absence, a void that grew with every life he consumed. Some Sith believed they could control him. They whispered to him in rituals, offered sacrifices, attempted to bind him with talismans forged from ancient alchemy. None worked. Their words dissolved in his presence, their power drained away like sand through open fingers. For Nihilus had no will to dominate, only to endure. His apprentice, Visa's Ma, saw his true nature more clearly than anyone. She described him not as a man, not as a lord, not as a monster, but as a pain that learned how to breathe. When she touched his mind for the first time, she saw nothing of herself reflected back, only hunger, only memory of loss, only the echo of Malachor repeating endlessly in the dark. Yet she survived, because Nihilus needed someone to follow him, someone to hear for him, someone to speak where he could not. He was powerful, but not whole, and it was that fracture, that incomplete shape that doomed him. The ritual that kept him alive demanded constant feeding. But the more he fed, the less he remained. His consciousness thinned, his body withered. His mask became the only stable part of him, holding his fragments together like a cracked vessel wrapped in tape. Eventually, even his thoughts became diluted, scattered pieces drifting through the force like ash in a dead wind. And still, he hunted. His armies fell, his followers deserted, his ship decayed. He did not notice. The galaxy narrowed to a single instinct: find life and consume it. But the Force does not allow impossibilities to endure forever. Mitra Surik found the flaw in him, the same flaw in herself. The wound, the echo, the emptiness left by Malachor. She recognized Nihilus not as an enemy, but as a reflection of what she might have become. She confronted him, not with power, with understanding. In the final moment, she let him feed on her. And for the first time, Nihilus tasted something he had not consumed in years. A wound that did not collapse. A void that did not surrender. Her emptiness swallowed his. And the ritual unraveled. His mask fell to the ground hollow, weightless, silent. No scream, no explosion, no shadow. Just absence returning to absence. Yet even in death, Nihilus remained wrong. The Force did not heal where he fell. It shuddered. Because some wounds never close. Some rituals never end. And across the galaxy, in forgotten corners where the Force still whispers of things best left sleeping, there are moments when the air grows thin, and a faint, cold hunger brushes against the edge of awareness. As if the void remembers. As if the mask still waits. As if Nihilus is not entirely gone. It didn't explode. It didn't burn. It didn't scream. When the ritual ended on Nathema, it left nothing behind. Not ruins. Not ashes. Not death. Only silence. The kind of silence that hums in the blood, that makes skin crawl and breath tighten. The kind of silence that isn't absence of sound, but the death of everything that could make sound. Before that day, Nathema had been a place of life. Quiet, ordered, full of noble houses and Force-sensitive bloodlines traced back thousands of years. It was one of the pure worlds, sacred to the Sith. Ruled by the elite, studied by mystics, feared by rivals. And in the heart of it was a boy, Tenebrae, born to a Sith Lord and a farmer's wife, conceived through violence, raised without affection, a child who killed without flinching, who could touch the Force before he could walk, not as a gift, as a weapon. His first act of will was murder. By age 6, he was bending minds. By 10, he made his father kneel. By 13, he ruled an entire world. He spoke little, he listened always, and when others looked into his eyes, they saw something wrong, not rage, not fire, not even hunger. Just cold, still, certain. He never lost control, because he never needed to. The Sith noticed. They sent lords to test him. He killed them. They sent fleets to break him. He shattered them. At age 14, he spoke before Marka Ragnos himself, and Ragnos gave him a name, Lord Vitiate. But Tenebrae didn't want titles. He wanted certainty. For all his power, he feared one thing, that life was temporary, that the Force gave only to take, that death was not a transition, but a theft. And if the Force could steal from him, he would learn to steal from it first. So he began studying. Not texts, not rituals, people. He dissected the minds of Sith Lords, learned how they thought, how they connected to the Force, how their power waxed and waned. He found the pattern, the flaw. Every Sith eventually fell to madness, to betrayal, to decay. That would not happen to him. So he designed a ritual. Not a spell, not a single event. A convergence. He called the Lords of Nathema together. All of them. Over 8,000 Force users, each powerful in their own way. He told them they would perform a rite to preserve their strength, to keep the Republic from sensing them, to protect the Sith bloodline from extinction. They agreed, they gathered, they stood in a circle that spanned miles. And vitiate began. He said no words, used no weapon. He only stood at the center and let his will unfold. They screamed. Then they vanished. Their power rushed inward, not into the air, not into the ground, into him. Their essence was stripped, devoured, rewritten. Every ounce of Force energy on Nathema poured into Tenebrae like blood into a wound. And the world died, not burned, not poisoned, erased. Every animal, every tree, every stone, every echo of the Force was gone. Not dormant, destroyed. The soil refused to grow. The air refused to carry breath. The light dimmed, as if even the sun had turned away. And in the center of the silence stood a man, not aged, not wounded, not changed in body, changed in being. Vitiate opened his eyes, and the Force did not look back, because now it belonged to him. He had not claimed immortality, he had become it. The ritual was complete, and the galaxy would not understand what had happened for centuries. The Jedi would feel the tremor but never find its source. The Sith would whisper of a world that could not be sensed. Explorers who visited Nathema would leave broken, blind, voiceless, mad, because the Force itself was missing there, not corrupted, not turned, gone, and the being who caused it had only just begun. Tenebrae did not breathe when the ritual ended. He didn't need to. His lungs moved, but only out of habit, as if his body remembered what life was supposed to feel like. But life was behind him now, beneath him, consumed. What stood on Nathema was not a Sith Lord, not a man, something else, something the Force no longer touched but obeyed. He walked through the empty fields, past corpses that hadn't decayed because even decay required the Force, past rivers that no longer flowed, past cities frozen mid-breath, statues of a world that had died without sound. But he felt nothing, not remorse, not triumph, not even satisfaction. The ritual had taken his emotions with everything else. For the first time in his life, Tenebrae was alone, not in the physical sense, but in the spiritual. The Force around him was gone. No light, no dark, no breath, no echo, only him. And in that void, he found immortality. Not the myth, not the fantasy, the truth. Immortality was not endless life. It was endless absence of death. The ritual had consumed every tether he once had, the threads that tied a being to aging, to pain, to decay. He was no longer connected to life enough to lose it. He had become an empty vessel that the Force could no longer claim. His body could be injured, but it would not weaken. His mind could fracture, but it would not fade. His spirit could be stretched across millennia, and still he would endure. He returned to what remained of Nathema's throne room. He stood in silence as days passed, then weeks, then months. Food rotted, lights dimmed, wind never blew, nothing lived. But he remained unchanged. Eventually, he tested his new state. He cut his palm. No blood came. He held his breath until his lungs should have failed. They didn't. He meditated in a void that offered no resistance, no guidance, no presence. He extended his will outward, and the galaxy trembled. He felt distant stars, faint breaths of life in corners far from Nathema's corpse. But the sensation was thin, blurry, distant. He realized something else the ritual had taken. He could no longer sense individuals, only power. People were forgotten shapes, souls were indistinct. But great wounds in the force planets, nexuses, temples, those he felt clearly. It didn't matter. He didn't need names. He needed only purpose. And purpose had already begun whispering, not in words. In instinct, the ritual had not ended, not truly. It had fused with his essence. It wanted more. It wanted growth. It wanted to erase the boundary between life and dominance so that one will could stand unchallenged. His will. He left Nathema without looking back. He boarded a ship, not because he needed sleep or comfort, but because the galaxy required a throne. He spoke to no one, yet followers gathered. Sith drawn to the cold in his voice. Soldiers mesmerized by his presence. Inquisitors trembling beneath a gaze that saw through them like glass. They called him emperor, but he did not rule. He absorbed. Every act of loyalty fed him. Every ritual performed in his name strengthened him. Every death in his empire echoed faintly in his being. He learned to anchor pieces of himself across the stars. Echoes, shadows, fragments of his consciousness layered into artifacts, temples, and servants. If his body died, he would slip into one of those fragments. If a fragment died, another would rise. If all fragments fell, he would build more. He perfected this art over centuries, not essence transfer, identity replication. He was not one voice. He was many, a chorus of himself, growing louder with time. With each ritual, he cut away more of his humanity. With each century, he forgot more of his past. With each life consumed, he became less a person and more a principle. Not a ruler, not even a monster, a concept, a presence, a hunger shaped into will. Immortality was no longer a choice. It was his nature, and the galaxy would soon learn what it meant to live under something that could not die, and did not remember why it lived. The first time Vitiate spoke after Nathema, his voice echoed in places he did not stand. It carried through stone, through metal, through minds too weak to resist. Not loud, not harsh, just inevitable. His followers felt it before they heard it, a pressure behind the eyes, a whisper beneath thought, a coldness that wrapped itself around their instincts. When the sound finally formed, it was not a command. It was a truth being installed. Because Vitiate no longer communicated, he imposed. The ritual that devoured Nathema had reshaped more than his body. It rewrote the way he touched the Force. Where others extended their will outward, Vitiate pushed inward, not invading minds, but collapsing them into alignment with his own. 1,000 voices might serve him, but only one will existed. At first, his subjects obeyed out of fear. Then obedience became habit. Then habit became reflex. Eventually, they no longer questioned why they listened, only why they ever imagined they wouldn't. He did not punish disloyalty. He erased it. A thought could be pulled apart as easily as a breath. A memory could be removed the way one plucks dust from a robe. Those who resisted his influence vanished, not killed, not exiled, simply unmade from memory, as though they had never drawn breath. The pure-blood Sith whispered that he was something beyond their line, a pretender who had stolen the essence of their ancestors, a creature wearing their traditions like a hollow mask. But even they bowed in the end. Vitiate began constructing the framework of a new empire, not one built on war or ambition, but on resonance. Every official, every soldier, every priest served as an extension of his mind. They prayed to him, not because they believed, but because his will turned their beliefs into alignment. He created the voice, a single vessel, capable of speaking for him when his body entered deep meditation. The voice appeared as a Sith Lord in shape and form, but inside carried a thread of vitiate's essence, just enough to be him, only enough to act for him. When the voice issued an order, it was law. When the voice killed, vitiate felt the death. When the voice died, he created another. But the voice was only the beginning. He created the hands assassins who acted on impulses they did not realize were not their own. He created the eyes spies who knew every secret except the one guiding their thoughts. He created the wrath, a weapon of pure destruction, molded by instinct vitiate planted like seeds in their minds. None of them served willingly. None of them served unwillingly. They simply served. Because vitiate's ritual had turned connection into dominance, the Force, once a field of balance and exchange, bent around him like gravity around a star. Anyone sensitive to it fell into orbit. Even the strongest Sith Lords found themselves pausing mid-thought, uncertain if the idea forming in their minds was theirs or his. The Jedi felt it too. A disturbance without direction, a shadow without shape, a presence so vast and cold it made meditation painful. For vitiate had learned something on Nathema, something no Sith had ever mastered. A will could be multiplied. He split his consciousness across worlds, across temples, across people. Each fragment independent, yet tethered back to the whole. If one failed, the others learned. If one learned, they all evolved. He no longer needed to travel to influence a planet. He no longer needed to speak to command a fleet. He no longer needed to kill to break a mind. Distance meant nothing. Resistance meant less. And through every echo, every fragment, every extension of his will, one truth became clear. He was not building an empire. He was building an identity network, a web of minds woven so tightly into his own that the boundaries between them faded. For them, thought became obedience. For him, obedience became sustenance. The ritual fed him still. Every life that aligned with his purpose added another layer to his immortality. Every soul that surrendered its autonomy became a pillar, holding up the endless weight of his existence. Yet with every fragment he cast outward, one piece of him slipped further away. His humanity fell first, the last fragile thing he could have saved. Then memory, then curiosity, then emotion. What remained was will without self, power without person, a storm without a center. And the galaxy began to understand. Vitiate did not rule the Sith. He consumed them, not through hunger, through identity. Every voice that served him was his own. He had done it. He had destroyed the Brotherhood. A single act, one ritual, a storm of dark side power that erased every Sith he had once called ally. Darth Bane walked out of the wreckage at the heart of Ruusan not as a victor but as a survivor. The last true Sith Lord. The first of the new line. And for the first time in 1,000 years, the future belonged to one will. His will. But time did not slow for Bane. And his body was beginning to fail. The ritual of Thought Bomb had taken a toll, not only on the hundreds it destroyed, but on the one who triggered it. The explosion had carved open a wound in the Force that left no Jedi, no Sith, no world untouched. But Bane had stood too close. Something inside him had fractured, not in spirit, in flesh. The first signs were subtle, pain in his hands that never dulled, muscle spasms during meditation, wounds that took longer to heal. He ignored them at first, blamed the strain of the war, the aftermath. the loneliness. But Bane was no fool. He knew his limits. And worse, he knew what lay beyond them. The rule of two demanded a successor, one to carry his legacy, one to be worthy. He found Xana a child of war, touched by the dark, forged in blood. She was not ready, but she would be. And when she was strong enough, she would challenge him. Kill him, replace him. That was the plan. But what if his body failed before she was ready? What if the disease in his bones outpaced her growth? What if death came not by combat, but by weakness? That was not the legacy Bane envisioned. He would not fade. He would not be forgotten. He began to search, not for medicine, not for healing, for rituals, ancient, forbidden, lost. Rites of Sith sorcery untouched since the days of the exiles. He pored over the scrolls recovered from Lehan. He translated fragments of holocrons that whispered through cracked lenses. And slowly, a path emerged. Essence transfer. A ritual so dark, so absolute, that even the ancient Sith had abandoned it, not out of fear, but because of failure. Too many minds destroyed in the process. Too many spirits lost in the void between bodies. Too many vessels broken beyond use. But Bane was no ordinary Sith. His will was stronger, his knowledge deeper, his purpose clearer. He began training Xana harder, testing her resolve, her cruelty, her ambition, all while perfecting the ritual in secret. Because if she failed to rise in time, he would not die. He would take her body, not out of malice, out of necessity. The rule of two demanded continuity. If she was not worthy of power, then her power would serve him longer. His flesh continued to weaken. Veins darkened, eyes yellowed. He wore gloves to hide the rot in his fingers, cloaks to conceal the tremble in his step. But Xana noticed. Her stares lingered too long. Her questions sharpened. She was close, but not yet strong enough, not yet certain. And Bane could feel death watching. He spoke less, meditated more. Every hour spent pushing his will deeper into the ritual's framework, binding his essence to his holocrons, preparing his mind to slip into another form, anchoring himself not to a body, but to existence itself. His nights were spent in silence, not resting, resisting, because the dark side offered no comfort, no warmth, only purpose. And Bane's purpose was survival. But survival at what cost? He had created a rule meant to break the cycle of weakness. One master, one apprentice, one lineage of strength through conflict. But now, the conflict would be internal. One soul, trying to claim another. If she failed to kill him, he would become her. And the rule would continue, through ruin, through violation, through the last body he would ever need. There was no instruction, no voice to guide him, no holocron that spoke clearly. The ritual of essence transfer existed only in fragments, half-burned scrolls, corrupted Sith tablets, whispers left behind by spirits too broken to rest. But Bane listened. He listened to the silence between ruins, to the pauses in the words of the ancients, to what was not said, and slowly he began to see. Essence transfer was not possession, it was annihilation. One mind would enter another, one will would battle for supremacy. The stronger soul would remain, the weaker would be destroyed. No compromise, no cohabitation, just a war of identity, fought in the shadows of thought, inside the skin of a single form. Most Sith who attempted it perished in the crossing. Some became trapped in formless agony. Others were torn apart mid-transfer, their bodies empty, their minds scattered into the Force. But Bane believed he had something they did not. Conviction. Not just in the ritual, in himself. He practiced in stages, first on beasts, low-thinking creatures, then on prisoners, weak-willed acolytes who had already given him everything. Their bodies would twitch, seize, burn, but he was learning. Each failure gave him more. Each scream brought him closer. He carved the sigils into stone. He branded the mantras onto his flesh. The language of the ritual was ancient Sith, but its meaning was universal, the obliteration of self so a greater will could rise. But time was running thin. His body ached more. His skin cracked beneath his robes. Even his connection to the Force began to flicker, not in strength, but in clarity. The dark side required pain, and Bane's pain was no longer focused. It was terminal. He had no choice. The ritual had to succeed. And Zana was finally ready. She didn't know, not yet, but the tension between them had sharpened. Her movements were more precise, her words more guarded. The time of succession was near, and Bane had made his decision. If she was strong enough to kill him in combat, she would earn the mantle of Dark Lord. But if she hesitated, if she faltered, he would take her, not to punish her, to preserve everything he had built. The Sith had died once before, crushed under their own arrogance and infighting. The rule of two was his answer. One Sith to hold power, one Sith to crave it, nothing else. And he would not let that vision die because his flesh had failed him. He returned to Ambria, a world steeped in lingering death, twisted by ancient rituals, a planet once healed by sacrifice, now silent, waiting. There, in the black desert, beneath the scorched sky, he made his final preparations. The chamber was simple: stone, sand, blood. He drew the ritual circle by hand, each mark cut deep into the ground, into memory, into meaning. He spoke no words. Words had no place here, only intention. He stripped himself of armor, let the pain guide him, sat at the center of the circle, legs folded, eyes closed, spirit braced. He could already feel the darkness gathering, not like a storm, like a mirror, cold, precise, unforgiving. And, in the distance, Zana approached, his apprentice, his heir, his vessel. He could feel her resolve even before she entered the chamber. A knife held tight, a mind sharpened by fury and fear. She would not ask questions, not now. They bowed only once, a motion born not of respect, but of finality. There would be no words exchanged, only will. She attacked first. Lightning flared, the battle began. And in every strike, Bane measured her. Not her power, her readiness. Could she carry the legacy? Could she endure what he had carved? Would she make it further than he did? The answer would come, but not in combat. As her blade met flesh, as the last of his strength waned, Bane spoke the final incantation. It wasn't a word. It was a cut in reality, a ripple of essence detaching from a dying shell. His soul launched forward, invisible, invasive, inevitable. Zana screamed, not in pain, in resistance. The ritual had begun. Ambria had always been a wound in the galaxy, a place where the dark side pooled like stagnant water. A place cleansed once by sacrifice, only to fall again into despair. It was the perfect place for a Sith to die, or to be reborn. The storm above the lake churned as Zana faced her master. Sand whipped across the ground in spirals, drawn toward the ritual circle like breath being pulled into a dying lung. The air trembled, the Force shivered. Bane pressed forward, each strike of his blade heavier than the last, each movement fueled not by strength, but by desperation. His body was failing, his muscles spasmed, black veins spread across his neck and arms. But his will, the same iron will that had shattered the Brotherhood, refused to break. Xana matched him. Not with brute force, with precision. Every motion was calculated, every parry measured. She did not fight to overpower him. She fought to survive long enough to outlast him. Because she knew what he intended. She felt it before the first blow landed, a pressure behind her thoughts, a shadow at the edge of her mind. Her master wasn't trying to kill her. He was preparing to invade her. Their sabers clashed, sparks falling like dying stars across the sand. Bane's breath grew uneven, not from weakness, but from transformation. His spirit was loosening, peeling away from a dying shell. Xana's heart pounded. Not with fear, with clarity. This was the moment the rule of two had been built for. This was her test. This was her inheritance. But Ambria itself intervened. The ground shook. Shadows moved beneath the surface of the black lake. The spirits trapped there, remnants of ancient rituals, responded to the battle. Their whispers curled around Xana's thoughts, tempting her to falter, to give in, to let Bane take what he desired. She tightened her grip, her jaw locked, her gaze fixed on the monster who had raised her. He lunged. Power surged through him, too sharp, too bright, too unstable. Lightning wrapped his arms, crawling across his skin like veins of fire. His body convulsed. The ritual was beginning too soon. Conflict accelerated it. Pain fueled it. Death invited it. He struck again. Xana fell back. Her knee hit the edge of the ritual circle. And Bane smiled. It was a twisted thing, stretched, desperate, hopeful. Not for victory, for survival. He needed proximity for the transfer to succeed. She was close enough now. He dropped his saber, raised both hands, and unleashed a torrent of dark energy so violent it tore the sand into the air like shrapnel. Xana screamed as it hit her. Her bones rattled, her vision fractured, her mind flickered. And inside that moment of agony, she felt him. Not physically, spiritually. A pressure pushing into her skull, slipping between her thoughts, clawing at her memories. Bane's essence poured through the cracks of her consciousness like molten metal, searching for foothold, for weakness, for a way to anchor. Xana staggered, falling to her knees. The world dimmed. The storm grew distant. The lake went silent. Inside her mind, the battle changed. No sabers, no bodies, no ground. Only two wills facing one another, one ancient, one rising, one decaying, one hungry, one desperate, one certain. Bane roared. His spirit crashed against hers, relentless, vast, fueled by decades of conquest and cruelty. He pushed into her memories, trying to break them, reshape them, claim them. He showed her pain, suffering, loss. He tried to drown her in her own fear. But Xana did not bend. She welcomed every image, every wound, every shadow of her past. Because she had been forged by him, and she had grown beyond him. Her will surged upward like a blade. She cut through his intrusion. She carved space for herself. She pushed back. Bane hesitated. It was small. A pause. A flicker. But it was enough. Xana struck with everything, her hatred, her ambition, her destiny. A tidal wave of identity, sharpened by years of training, hardened by every cruelty he had given her. The spirits beneath Ambria stirred, the lake pulsed, the ritual circle glowed. The force itself waited. One will would remain, one would vanish. Xana screamed. Bane roared. and their souls collided. There was no explosion, no flash of light, only silence, and in that silence, one will faded. The battle of spirits within Xana's mind ended not with triumph, but with stillness, a long, heavy pause, as if the force itself had stopped breathing, waiting to see what remained. She opened her eyes, and the storm had passed. Bane's body lay broken at her feet, silent, scorched, empty. But the ritual left a question. Was he truly gone? Or had he taken root inside her? Xana stood, trembling. Her fingers curled involuntarily. Her breath slowed, then stilled, then returned with a rhythm not her own. She could still feel him. Deep inside her thoughts, there was a whisper, not a word, a pressure, like a buried echo that refused to fade. For a moment, she hesitated. Had he succeeded? Had he become her? No. The voice was not command, it was memory. Fading, cracking, losing shape. She focused, she pushed, and the shadow receded. Bane's presence unraveled like smoke in wind. A final defiance before dissolution. He had tried, and for a moment, he had nearly won. But she remained. Xana, not the apprentice, not the heir, the master. She bent over his corpse, not to mourn, not to honor, but to understand. This was the cost. This was the end of Bane's flesh, but not the end of his doctrine. His bones would decay, his voice would vanish, but his rule would endure. She buried him not in a grave, but in fire. Let the ashes scatter across Ambria, across the sands that had witnessed their war. Let no tomb be built, let no monument remain. The only legacy he deserved was one that moved forward, and that legacy was her. But legacy was not survival. It was continuation, and the rule of two demanded it. She could not carry the Sith alone. She would need an apprentice. One who burned as she once did. One who questioned. One who hated. One who wanted. It would take time, but she would find them. Not in the old temples. Not in the broken worlds. But somewhere small. Somewhere forgotten. The next Sith would not be found in glory, they would be forged in silence. Like she had been, Xana left Ambria with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge inside her mind. She took no relics, no holocrons, no trophies. The Force was her inheritance, the future was her test. And in that future, Bane would fade. He had believed power must be seized, that dominance was the path to immortality. But immortality came not from ritual, not from possession, but from being remembered. And Xana would remember. Not kindly, not as a father, but as a warning. She would take the rule of two, and she would carry it beyond what Bane could imagine. She would make it leaner, sharper, less indulgent, more ruthless. Because now she understood. The rule was not about who lived. It was about who endured. And Bane, for all his strength, had not. She whispered no eulogy, spoke no final words. Only silence and purpose. Somewhere across the stars, the Jedi Order stirred, sensing a shift, but not understanding it. They would not know her name. Not yet. But they would feel her will. In time, they would call it the dark side's return. In truth, it never left. It had only evolved. It had chosen. And in the stillness that followed, beneath Ambria's empty sky, a new Sith Lord stepped into shadow, not as a servant of death, but as its master. Xana turned away from the ash. The storm had passed, and the rule of two remained. The Jedi believed the Sith were gone. After Bane, after Xana, after the dark vanished from the outer stars and silence took its place, The Republic flourished. Peace spread like sunlight across the mid-rim, and the Order forgot. But in the shadows of Coruscant, beneath the surface of planets once ruled by fear, a different truth lingered. The Sith had never died. They had shifted, not in armies, not in fleets, in whispers. Sidious was only the latest echo, not the beginning, not the end, but a continuation. His power was built not only on deception, but on rituals far older than him. As Supreme Chancellor, he wore a mask of diplomacy, but as Dark Lord of the Sith, he remembered. He studied the same texts Bane had preserved. He spoke the same chants Sado had once whispered into the stars. He carved the same symbols into stone and flesh, not for decoration, but for control. There were ceremonies held in secret, deep beneath the Senate building rooms, not recorded on any blueprint. Vaults wrapped in cortosis, shielding them from the Jedi's vision. Here, Sidious communed with what others feared. He did not rely solely on the Force. He shaped it, through incantation, through blood, through sacrifice. The old Sith had taught that control of death was the truest power. Sidious agreed, but he expanded the meaning. Death wasn't merely to be defied, it was to be used, to bind, to channel, to enslave. He constructed relics beneath Coruscant, objects that radiated darkness. One was a simple ring etched with runes from Malachor. Another, a crystal, shaped not to contain light, but to consume it. Each was linked to rituals that no Jedi dared speak. Not every ceremony had a target. Some existed only to corrupt the air. A constant drain on the Force around him. A thinning of the light. A deepening of the dark. He understood what Bane had not, that secrecy wasn't the Sith's weakness. It was their strength. The less the Jedi noticed, the more power he could summon. And so, he invited no apprentices for years. He spoke to no council. He offered no prophecy. He simply waited and chanted. There were followers, of course. Not Sith. Not truly. But they wore red. They called themselves loyal. The early Sith cultists, those who would one day become the Imperial Guard, began not as soldiers, but worshippers. They observed the Emperor's meditations. They mimicked his posture. They memorized his words. They believed he was the dark side. And in their reverence, he found fuel. Their loyalty became a ritual of its own, a living sacrifice of freedom and self, bound to his will. Some gave their blood. Others gave their sanity. All gave their names. They did not ask for reward, only permission to kneel. Sidious never needed them to understand the Force. He only needed them to feed it. In chambers colder than space, lit by nothing but flickering runes, he would draw their essence into himself, not to extend his life, but to enrich his dominion. He believed the galaxy could be rewritten, not just ruled. And to do that, he needed more than armies. He needed liturgy. He needed fear. And so, the rituals multiplied. Not in public. Not even in the inner circle. Only in shadow. A whisper here. A sigil left in blood on a prison wall. A dream that echoed across thousands of minds, promising power for a price. The Jedi noticed anomalies. Children born without light. Worlds that seemed to fade from the Force. Visions of flame, of laughter, of nothing. But they explained it away. Balance, they said. Destiny, they claimed. But beneath their feet, Sidious was chanting, his voice low, his will absolute, and the dark was listening. Exegol was not a planet. It was a wound, a place not charted, not spoken of, not meant to be found. It did not orbit a sun. It did not reflect light. It existed in a pocket of space so lost, so severed from the Force's natural flow, that even time moved differently. This was where the oldest Sith dreams had been buried, not to be forgotten, but to be preserved. Sidious did not build Exegol. He discovered it. The ancient texts from the depths of the Sith Eternal Archives spoke of it only as a whisper, the place beyond death. It was not meant for war. It was meant for rebirth. Here, beneath a sky that never changed, he created not a fortress, but a sanctuary. Not for himself, but for his rituals. The Sith cultists who followed him, robed in grey ash, blind to light, sworn to silence, formed what they called the Unbroken Circle. They did not serve the Empire. They did not seek conquest. They served only the chant. They believed in one thing, that the dark side must not only survive, it must be perfected. And perfection demanded sacrifice. Beneath the citadel, in chambers carved from obsidian, entire generations of loyalists were raised with no language but ritual. Infants were immersed in alchemical pools to sever their bond with the light. Their cries echoed across walls that had once seen the rituals of Darth Mummin, of Belia Dazu, of Vitiate himself. Every scream was fuel. Every breath was offering. Sidious fed upon them, not physically, not with hunger, but with intention. Each life became a note in a song of power that extended beyond death, not to preserve the body, but to anchor the spirit. It was here that he performed the most forbidden rite of all. Essence. Multiplicity, a ritual theorized by ancient Sith but never perfected. Not cloning, not resurrection, duplication of self. To exist in more than one form. To leave behind a body, but retain control. To fracture consciousness across vessels. Some called it madness. Sidious called it design. The cultists built the tanks. The flesh was grown. But the mind, that was his. Transfer was not always perfect. The early bodies decayed too fast. Some rejected his presence. Others screamed endlessly until their skulls shattered. He did not weep. He recorded. Each failure brought the circle closer to their dark gospel. At the heart of the ritual was not science. It was faith. They believed Sidious was the true voice of the Force. That he was not just a Sith, but the culmination of Sith. They called him the Shadow made flesh, and in return, he gave them purpose. He let them witness the storms above Exegol, unnatural, churning fields of energy fed by sacrifice. He let them touch the statues of ancient lords, preserved in stone, faces unknown, names forgotten, and he let them die in silence. Every decade, hundreds would walk into the ritual chamber and vanish, their lives offered freely to strengthen the veil between life and death. Not because he demanded it, because they believed in it. They believed the Sith must never die, and in that belief, the rituals deepened. New chants were created, blending ancient Sith with high galactic. Hymns were sung to the rhythm of lightning strikes. Incantations were drawn not on walls, but in flesh carved into the bodies of those who served. And all of it, for one goal, immortality. But not the kind the Jedi feared. Not life beyond death, but dominion that never ended. The fleet above Exegol was not built for war. It was built as offering. Each ship was a ritual node. Each crew member a devotee. Each kyber crystal embedded within the hull, stolen from fallen Jedi temples, screamed with repurposed agony. This was no longer about ruling the galaxy. It was about rewriting it. Through dark ritual, through endless ceremony, and even when Sidious fell, even when his vessel collapsed, even when the light returned, The circle did not scatter. They simply knelt and continued chanting, because the ritual had never been about him. It had always been about the Sith. And rituals never end. The Sith are gone, but the rituals remain, not in temples, not in holocrons, in silence, in symbols, in scars. Even after the fall of Sidious, even after the defeat at Exegol, the Force did not rebalance. It trembled. Because rituals are not bound to a name. They do not die with their masters. They linger across the outer rim. Abandoned outposts once used by the Empire pulse with strange energy. In the unknown regions, ships drift with no crew, only inscriptions burned into the walls, glowing faintly when touched by fear. Jedi sent to investigate come back changed. Or not at all. Because even in death, the Sith kept teaching. On Dathomir, where the Night Sisters once channeled their own twisted rituals, the land still remembers their songs. Rancors avoid the ruins. The winds speak only in whispers. And beneath the soil, bones throb with ancient chants that have no words. These were not just Sith rituals, but Sith echoes, remnants of belief. The rituals of the Sith were never designed to be temporary. They weren't just tools, they were anchors. Each incantation, each offering, each death, meant to bind the dark side to the physical world so tightly that not even time could unwind it. And so, the galaxy forgot. But the rituals didn't. There are children born with knowledge they shouldn't have, visions that don't belong to them, nightmares filled with red sand and black lightning. They don't know the names, but they speak the words. Fragments of Korriban, fragments of Exegol, fragments of pain. Some say it's just residue, that after so much war, so much darkness, the Force is simply resetting. But others know better. Some Mandalorians who once served as mercenaries during the Clone Wars speak of contracts made with cloaked figures who bled their credits into bowls and vanished. Sith cultists still exist not in legions, but in lines, in bloodlines, passed down not through name, but through ritual. A father cuts his hand during a thunderstorm and bleeds into the soil, whispering to something that isn't there. A daughter draws symbols on her skin without knowing why. A senator in the mid-rim wakes screaming, having dreamed of a mask one worn by a man who died 4,000 years ago. These aren't coincidences. They're residues, because the Sith believed in permanence, and rituals are their fingerprints. Even now, Jedi historians argue over certain ruins. Whether they are Sith in origin, or something worse. Whether the inscriptions are warnings, or invitations. The truth is, they are both. Every ritual the Sith performed was layered in intention. Not just power, not just dominance, but memory. To be remembered was to continue existing. And the Force remembers. A ritual performed on Malachor can still affect the soil. A name spoken on Zyast can still draw shadows. A blade forged on Korriban can still hum when drawn in rage. The Sith understood something the Jedi never dared admit. That the dark side wants to be repeated. It calls for it. And every time someone gives in to anger, every time hatred is nurtured, every time a whisper is heard when no one is there, the ritual begins again. Not with words, but with feeling. Because Sith rituals are not just spells, they are emotions weaponized. Fear, pain, loss, desire. They are the echoes of every soul that wanted more and gave up everything to get it. And so they remain, in crumbling tombs, in forbidden databanks, in cold places where the Force won't speak. The Sith may no longer wear armor or rule empires, But the scars they carved into the galaxy never healed. Somewhere, a Padawan dreams of lightning and doesn't know why. Somewhere, a shrine lights itself during a lunar eclipse. Somewhere, a storm never ends. Because the rituals outlived the Sith, and they are waiting for someone to remember them. Not all darkness is loud. Some of it speaks gently, far from war zones, far from temples, far from anything the Jedi would consider important. It settles into forgotten moons, uncharted stations, quiet places where the Force bends without notice. There, in the hush between stars, the Sith still breathe, not through bodies, through memory. And in memory, ritual never dies. Out past the Outer Rim, in sectors untouched since the fall of the Old Republic, survey droids sometimes pick up signals that can't be translated. Patterns of pulsing noise too rhythmic for static, too emotional for code. Those who trace it find nothing, but they leave, changed. Their dreams become thick, their thoughts slow. They begin to draw patterns they don't understand on datapads, in dust, on their skin. Symbols that match those buried in the tombs of Korriban. Glyphs seen only once, by Jedi who never returned. They don't remember why they drew them, only that it felt important. Something wants to be remembered. In the deep core, there are stations that predate known history, derelict, motionless, full of rooms too large for their purpose. Rooms with walls covered in handprints, some human, some not. When explorers walk inside, their lights dim, their minds wander. They speak to people who aren't there. And when they leave, they take part of the station with them, not in tools or relics, but in knowing. They begin to whisper, not out loud, but in the Force. The Sith once called this soul resonance. The belief that emotion, when repeated enough times in a single place, could infect the very fabric of reality. Not hauntings, imprints, the last breath of a dying ritual, still searching for a voice. And in this way, the Sith still perform their rites without temples, without blades, without even knowing who listens. They are the murmurs in forgotten corridors, the red glow behind sealed doors, the sense of being watched by something that has no eyes. And those who hear them don't always run. Some stay, some kneel, some answer, because the promise remains the same. Power. The old Sith Lords knew this. That fear fades, but curiosity grows. So they laced their rituals with questions, left them unfinished, marked them with names no one could pronounce except the one who was meant to find it. And someone always does. Even now, in the age after Palpatine, when the Jedi whisper of balance and the Sith are said to be extinct, there are those who wander the void and feel pulled. They call it instinct. They call it the Force. But it's something else. It is the weight of 10,000 rituals, of blood spilled in rhythm, of chants that echo across time. It is the hunger of the Sith legacy still alive, not in form, but in intention. And that is what they never understood. The Jedi believed in harmony. The Sith believed in continuity. Not through lineage, through ritual. Because as long as someone repeats the words, as long as pain is remembered, as long as someone wants what should not be theirs, the Sith endure. Maybe not as lords, maybe not as empires, but as shadows. And shadows don't need permission. They grow in silence. They move without sound. They whisper until someone listens. So, even now, even in the quiet, even as the galaxy spins into a future full of hope and healing, the rituals wait, in dust, in blood, in song. The Force still trembles in places it shouldn't, because somewhere, A boy will find a name no one taught him. A girl will speak words that make stars flicker. A world will go dark for no reason at all. And someone will ask why. And someone else will answer. They are only whispers, only shadows, only rituals, still repeating, still bleeding, still waiting to begin again.